The United States has a serious drug problem, and it's bigger than you think, with the Chinese government strategically employing Mexican drug cartels as a pawn in its rivalry with the United States. This issue, if not faced head-on, will have geopolitical consequences that will extend well beyond the boundaries of the Western Hemisphere. Could the U.S. military become the ultimate game-changer in this war? Let's find out. The opioid crisis has actually caused life expectancy within the country to decrease over the last few years, and fentanyl is one of the biggest reasons. This synthetic opioid is much more powerful than traditional drugs. The CDC estimates there were 100,306 drug overdose deaths in the United States between 2020 and 2021, up over 56,000 from the previous measuring period. The pandemic made the trend, which was already increasing, even worse. Fentanyl, originating in China and shipped north of the border by Mexican drug cartels, is responsible for many of these deaths. The crisis has led some American policymakers to consider declaring the Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs, which would subject them to military force. But what's stopping this from happening? Why hasn't the military taken part in active anti-narcotics operations in the past? What obstacles would such a mission face? And should the drug cartels south of the border be officially designated as FTOs? What range of options would the United States Armed Forces have to intervene? The Mexican drug cartels are vast criminal enterprises, so powerful that they sometimes compete with the government of Mexico itself for authority. Drugs, weapon smuggling, human trafficking, cybercrime, and kidnapping are all part of their plethora of illicit activities. They have their own territories that they govern as pseudo-narco states, subjecting the populations within their control to their wills, and they have made travel throughout the country much more dangerous for Mexican nationals and foreigners alike. In March 2023, after an attack on a group of American tourists visiting Mexico, which resulted in 2 deaths, a group of Republican United States senators led by Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, introduced legislation called the Ending the Notorious, Aggressive, and Remorseless Criminal Organizations and Syndicates Act, NARCOS. This bill would designate 9 Mexican drug cartels as FTOs. The designation would give American law enforcement agencies greater power to freeze their assets, deny their members entry into the United States, and increase penalties for those people who materially support these organizations. It would also give the United States military options to take part in counter-narcotics operations that it does not now have. Imagine a compound belonging to one of the Mexican drug cartels on Mexican soil. Then imagine a drone-launched Hellfire missile blowing the compound to kingdom come. This would be one such option should the U.S. government officially designate the cartels as FTOs. Another possibility? Imagine the Rangers, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, or Delta Force conducting a targeted nighttime raid on that compound instead, almost like the attack on Osama bin Laden's compound in Pakistan in 2011. That would also be an option if the Mexican drug cartels were to get designated as FTOs by the United States government. The idea of using the military against the Mexican drug cartels has been a frequent topic of public discussion within the United States, but so far has not come to fruition. Why? Although the thoughts of America's best warriors bringing the cartels to justice are pleasant ones, many policymakers in Washington fear that should the U.S. military get further involved than its informal advisory role to law enforcement on drug-related matters, it would threaten the country's relationship with Mexico. For its part, the Mexican government has historical reasons to be concerned about the United States military involvement in its territory. The United States has militarily intervened in Mexico several times in the past. In the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848, the United States clawed vast tracts of territory from Mexico in the resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States also used military force on Mexican soil while the latter country was in the throes of its revolution between 1910 and 1920. There, the U.S. Army was chasing Pancho Villa in a campaign lasting from 1916 to 1917. The Mexican government has reason to be jittery and fear that American military intervention within its borders could escalate into an outright invasion or a painful counterinsurgency campaign. And the Mexican government has other reasons to fear the cartels within their territory being listed as FTOs by the United States. Although it is unlikely that Mexico itself would ever be listed as a state sponsor of these organizations, the designation that there are FTOs operating within its territory would still make foreign governments and companies assess it as riskier to invest in. The designation would also hurt international tourism, which generates around $20 billion a year in Mexico and counts for about 8.5% of its GDP. Additionally, Mexico is a USMCA member with deep ties to American companies. In March 2023 alone, trade between the United States and Mexico reached $72.1 billion, an increase of 4.52% compared to March 2022. Trade between the two countries is about $750 billion annually. If the drug war escalates through American military intervention in Mexico, there is a risk for that trade to become disrupted, increasing supply chain problems and the resulting inflation that the American public has been dealing with for the past couple of years. The disruption of trade could worsen inflation in other ways too. Some of the United States' biggest exports to Mexico are energy products. These commodities include oil, gasoline, and liquefied natural gas. Such energy products fulfill a demand worth about $11 billion in March 2023 alone. If demand from Mexico for these products declines, the energy companies might be forced to raise prices on already existing customers to make up the shortfall, increasing Americans' energy bills. Mexico also exports vast quantities of commodities that the U.S. economy depends on, such as completed vehicles, personal and commercial, vehicle parts, computers, and medical equipment, among others. The economic consequences for disrupted trade on Mexico would be further reaching than inflation. The United States has dealt with an unprecedented border crisis since 2021, as millions of migrants have made the perilous journey north, with millions more expected in the months and years to come. If the United States military intervenes against the drug cartels and, as an unforeseen consequence, disrupts the trading network, say with the occasional errant drone strike, it will likely increase the amount of people coming north seeking replacement jobs. So, there are good reasons for the opposition to the designation of the drug cartels as FTOs by certain parts of Washington. In trying to solve one problem, it becomes important to not create others of equal or greater magnitude. Additionally, drug cartels do not set up shop in isolated compounds that are vulnerable to drone strikes or special operations forces. Most of the time, the drug cartel's infrastructure is less like the Osama bin Laden compound and more like the insurgents in Iraq. The cartels conduct their operations in the middle of cities and around a lot of commercial and civilian infrastructure. That's another reason why many policymakers and experts are concerned about the idea of American military intervention in Mexico. Imagine the headlines if civilians there get killed by a drone strike by mistake. Additionally, the Mexican drug cartels are known to use child soldiers as young as 11 years old. It is highly likely that these ruthless organizations would put these children on the front lines in such a confrontation with American troops. Such incidents would undermine the image of the United States as the world's humanitarian leader. All the same, the drug cartels are a serious and growing problem, with geopolitical implications that go far beyond the Western Hemisphere. As noted, the Mexican drug cartels are essentially being used as a cat's paw by the Chinese government in its competition with the United States. Since the fentanyl ingredients are manufactured in China, the Mexican drug cartels have become a tool of Chinese government policy. The Chinese military may not yet have the capability of withstanding a direct confrontation with its American counterpart, but if China can exert levers, which can lead to the deaths of thousands a year in the American homeland through this indirect channel, it has greater leverage in its negotiations with the United States. After then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in the summer of 2022, the world's attention fell to the Chinese military's massive exercises off the island that lasted for several days. However, for the American homeland, an announcement by the Foreign Ministry in the aftermath of Pelosi's visit was much more important. In it, the Chinese regime said it would suspend its cooperation with the United States on narcotics trafficking, including in fentanyl. Transnational crime was also an area that China announced its suspension of cooperation on. This announcement was a tacit admission from the regime that it would shy even further away from intervention against fentanyl dealers and their relationship with the Mexican drug cartels. As the Chinese regime controls the world's most sophisticated surveillance apparatus, it is highly unlikely that it's not fully aware of its domestic fentanyl industry. Fentanyl shipments to Mexico are therefore a conscious policy choice on the part of the Chinese government. The Chinese regime's drug policy is part of its overall approach to foreign policy. The Chinese Communist Party is still haunted by what it views as the century of humiliation, the years between 1839 and 1949, when China routinely suffered at the hands of foreign powers. China sees its fentanyl partly as revenge for the opium wars of the 1830s and 1840s, where the British Empire used military force to ensure it could sell its opium products into the Chinese market. The Chinese regime sees fentanyl not just as a way to make a profit, but part of a comprehensive, historically based foreign policy to ensure that it is strong and its opponents weak. The United States government can therefore not stand idly by, as the Mexican drug cartels are now an instrument of Chinese policy. They've become a player in the burgeoning great power rivalry between the United States and China. It is unsurprising that many policymakers in Washington are getting itchier to use a military response, especially since this tool of Chinese statecraft is so close to home. Removing these dangerous middlemen from the equation would also make China's destabilizing foreign policy more difficult for it to conduct. With fentanyl increasingly being disguised as candy and other things that could be enticing to children, it is clear that the problem is growing. The cartels themselves are also getting more sophisticated and powerful. For example, the Los Zetas cartel has recruited American soldiers as hitmen for their operations. Hundreds of thousands of people in Mexico work for these sprawling criminal empires, and many more benefit from the drug economy even when they're not involved with the criminal element. Los Zetas and the other cartels have also been building ever more sophisticated armored vehicles. These are not simply pickup trucks with light machine guns attached to their backs, but armored trucks and personnel carriers with sophisticated weapons like 50 caliber machine guns. Fortunately, the cartels have yet to equip themselves with explosive turrets atop their vehicles like a proper tank, but they have made use of grenade-dropping drones. The geopolitical consequences of the drug wars and the growing sophistication of the cartels mean that the policy responses of the past are no longer adequate to solve the crisis. A more proactive approach is needed, especially with the increasing militarization of the drug cartels and the personnel that work for them. The United States military's restriction to a law enforcement advisory role is by definition a reactive approach. So would there be alternative proactive approaches that would involve unleashing the might of the armed forces on the cartels, ones which might involve less damage to Mexico and with less risk of escalation or mission creep that could result in a grueling counterinsurgency style of warfare? 2 months before Graham and his co-sponsors introduced the Narcos Act, Congressman Dan Crenshaw, Republican from Texas, introduced the Declaring War on the Cartels Act of 2023. This legislation would increase the United States' ability to impose sanctions on foreign governments or other entities determined to have assisted the cartels or failed to have made adequate attempts to suppress them. Penalties would increase for individuals deemed to be accessories to cartel-related crimes, with mandatory 15-year additional prison sentences. Meanwhile, the law would require the Department of Homeland Security to create an apparatus to monitor efforts in countries deemed to be affected by cartel activity. The legislation would also loosen restrictions against U.S. military involvement in Mexico, but in a more careful way than if the cartels were designated as FTOs. Crenshaw said of that possibility, "It doesn't necessarily mean just dropping bombs right away. Diplomatically, it means that we have a whole new leverage over the government. The Mexican government does not like to deal with this problem. They like to ignore it. This is obviously a real war, and they obviously need our help, and we should have an authorization to allow that. I think this gives the president leverage, and I would think it would be a win." Leverage over Mexico would be secured, Crenshaw hopes, through the threat of military action against the cartels. The bill implies that if the Mexican government were to believe that a military response from the United States would happen, regardless of its involvement, it would be more amenable to cooperating in the effort rather than standing on the sidelines, forcing it out of its complacency to organized crime, which, as we'll see shortly, is deeply ingrained within Mexico's government and political culture. The approach championed by Crenshaw would see joint operations between the United States and Mexican militaries in a much harder line against the cartels, prompting the latter to go along with the new status quo. With Mexico involved in such operations, there is less of a chance for diplomatic misunderstandings or miscalculations. There would also be less chatter that the United States would be invading Mexico by using its military in anti-drug operations. Joint military cooperation between the two countries in anti-drug efforts would also reduce the likelihood of mission creep, a common problem in the United States military operations of the last 20 years. Supposedly limited interventions have led to decades worth of counterinsurgency operations, and the history of mission creep goes back much farther than the War on Terror. For example, American military intervention in the Mexican Revolution led to a campaign that eventually became an embarrassing debacle for the United States Army. Despite its initial victory, the last thing anyone wants is a similar 21st century campaign in Mexico. Close cooperation with the Mexican military, of the like that the Crenshaw approach favors, would make the possibility less likely. Unfortunately, the prospect of securing the cooperation of Mexico in this kind of escalation of the drug war is not guaranteed, and it brings with it its own dangers. The country has a corruption problem, and the Mexican government has ties with the cartels at every level and across every department. Critics have accused the Mexican army of giving the cartels a wide berth to conduct their operations, while it merely stands by and watches, at best patrolling the lines between the different cartels' territories and standing idly by as they embarked on their illegal activities only a few hundred yards away. The Mexican military had once taken a more proactive approach, but since the rise of Manuel López Obrador to the country's presidency, the government's policy toward the cartels has become less confrontational. Famously, Obrador said that his approach to pacify the drug cartels would involve hugs, not bullets. This was in response to earlier Mexican policy that had seen the use of military force, which did not always turn out splendidly. In 2019, Obrador, in response to one of the cartel's operations in the northern city of Culiacán, ordered the release of Ovidio Guzman, son of the infamous drug kingpin El Chapo, in an attempt to avoid further bloodshed. Unfortunately, the hugs not bullets policy has led to the passive policy of some Mexican army units we just talked about, and it raises questions about whether Congressman Crenshaw's approach to the problem would find cooperative ears south of the border. There would also be concerns that American operations and other sensitive information could actually be passed along to the cartels. In the middle of October 2022, a leak of more than 6.5 million documents exposed the deep corruption within the Mexican government and the military. A group of hackers going under the name Guacamaya released the data and showed numerous embarrassing examples of official malfeasance. For example, the governor of the Mexican state of Tabasco between 2019 and 2021, Adán Augusto López Hernández, put 3 known members of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel in powerful positions within the local security services. The result was, the cartel gained access to sensitive information and powerful military weapons. The hacked information also revealed that Mexican soldiers routinely sell weapons to the cartels, that law enforcement officials took bribes. One such official took $250,000 to protect the cartels, and that the military keeps detailed files on politicians and political activists rather than the members of the organized crime syndicates. Mayors throughout Mexico were also shown to have close links with the drug cartels. The documents also revealed corruption north of the border too. The influence of the cartels permeated among officials at all levels of government. One official in the United States was convicted of taking over $5 million in bribes from the cartels. Thousands of investigations have been conducted or are pending. President Obrador was dismissive of the hack, saying there's nothing that isn't known or shouldn't be known in the leaks. Unfortunately, the attempts at brushing over the problems fooled no one, and the corruption problems on both sides of the border leave the United States military in a bind should it attempt cooperation with its Mexican counterpart. Since corruption in Mexico goes high up the food chain of the defense ministry, there is a high likelihood that the cartels would be tipped off to at least some of the strikes or raids on their activities. Such leaks would put American soldiers in danger and increase the likelihood of American blood being spilled on Mexican soil. The risk of escalation and all the problems that come with it that we already went over would significantly increase at this point. For these reasons, there is a good possibility that Congressman Crenshaw's approach would fail. The more unilateral sudden strike approach of Graham and his co-sponsors becomes easier to justify when viewed in the light of Mexico's corruption problems involving the cartels. Indeed, sharing military knowledge and equipment with the Mexican military is all but asking for some of it to fall into the hands of the cartels. This was precisely how the Los Zetas cartel got its start. Designating Los Zetas and their peers as FTOs skips several steps and reduces the possibility that they will gain access to American equipment and secrets. Regardless of the United States military's role in the drug wars, it is likely that Washington will need to take more active measures against the Mexican cartels. The status quo is increasingly anathema to American interests, and these are not even the drug wars of 10 years ago. The entrance of fentanyl and the Chinese Communist Party into the equation changed things dramatically. Look for more legislative proposals from senators and congressmen to come in the near future, which will include the potential use of military force. But what do you think? Should the U.S. military get involved in the war against drugs? In what way? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
America is losing the war on drugs. The opioid crisis threatens the very fabric of US society. In the past 25 years, an estimated 800,000 lives have been lost, and millions of others ripped apart by a cycle of addiction, poverty, crime, and premature death. In an article with UK newspaper The Guardian from January 2024, Dr. Art Van Zee said, "It didn't have to happen. There were so many missed opportunities, so many times it could have been stopped. Now, I don't see how it ends." If the country doesn't take decisive action, many of the communities worst affected might never conceivably recover. In an unprecedented move, President Joe Biden has called an emergency meeting with his Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III and the heads of each branch of the military. Biden, like so many of his predecessors, knows exactly where these drugs are coming from and exactly who to target: Mexico and its infamous drug cartels. He knows he's reached the point of no retreat and that it's his responsibility to tackle the problem head-on, and that starts today. But why has the Biden administration decided to act now? Two reasons: fentanyl and China. In an interview back in May 2023, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland called the Mexico-based Sinaloa cartel the largest, most violent, and most prolific fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. The drug itself, a synthetic opioid, is up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine, a truly chilling indication of exactly how deadly this drug can be. Various governmental agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the military, have all tracked the cartel's supply chains and money laundering networks back to China. Even more troublingly, they've identified exactly where the ingredients to make one of the most addictive opioids on the planet have come from: the same country, China. However, an all-out assault on the Mexican drug cartels will be a tricky proposition to sell to both Congress and the American people. The economic ramifications alone could be disastrous. But when the president heard that fentanyl was being smuggled into the country disguised as candy and that it could quite easily be mistaken as such by young children, he knew the time for talking had stopped. Hour 1. The meeting commences. The battle lines are drawn. Biden is in a prickly, confrontational mood. He paces up and down the Oval Office and informs Austin, General Charles Q. Brown Jr., Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Christopher W. Grady, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Randy A. George, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Christopher J. Mahoney, Acting Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Admiral Lisa M. Franchetti, Chief of Naval Operations, of his plan of action. Folks, with your help, we're going to wreck the Mexican drug cartels once and for all. We're going to launch an attack so devastating and precise that we will shatter their operations completely. George is the first to express his surprise. Like the other top military officials in attendance, he presumed this was no more than a standard briefing. "What do you mean exactly, Mr. President?" "Just what I said. We're going to strike at the drug cartels in their own backyards, and we're going to put them out of commission within the next 24 hours. The room becomes a hive of activity, argument, counter-argument, and hypotheses. But Biden has already put Port Huachuca, the nearest U.S. military base to the Mexican border, on high alert. Situated in Cochise County, Arizona, the complex has a population of about 6,500 active-duty soldiers. Only in recent weeks, that number has swelled exponentially, and the site has been the scene of top-secret military operations. Additional troops and military hardware have been covertly delivered to the base in preparation for a surprise attack on the drug cartels. Over the next 45 minutes, Biden and his team draw up a two-pronged attack. Firstly, the 4 biggest cartels will be targeted by systematic drone strikes. Not that this will be a wholly straightforward part of the mission. The drug-making and distribution facilities identified by U.S. intelligence are situated in different parts of the country, in some cases hundreds of kilometers apart. The Sinaloa cartel in the northwest, the Jalisco cartel, mainly in the Tierra Caliente region, the Gulf cartel in the northeast, centered around the border state of Tamaulipas, and the Los Zetas cartel, also in the same northeasterly region. "But sir," says Randy, "our drones don't have that kind of range to hit targets that far away from Huachuca. As a result, we'll never be able to coordinate the kind of synchronized attacks you talked about." That's when Biden reveals his ace card: the Mexican government. Since 2006, the country declared its own war on the cartels. 360,000 citizens have been victims of drug-related homicide. Despite partnering closely with the US, receiving billions of dollars to modernize its security forces, reform its judicial system, and fund development projects to curb migration, no real or lasting progress has been made. Ultimately, Washington hoped to stem the flow of illegal drugs into the country by bolstering security and monitoring operations along the border, but to no avail. Like his American counterpart, Mexican leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as he's called in the popular press, knows that the time for empty rhetoric and procrastination is well and truly over. It's time to act. In maneuvers just as covert, Mexican military hardware and troops have been gathering in the northwest and northeast of the country. Unbeknown to the drug cartels, they are now under round-the-clock surveillance and are about to be subject to a devastating attack, the likes of which have rarely, if ever, been seen before. Secondly, and decisively, ground troops then swarm on each of the targeted cartel facilities to ensure that they have all been put out of operational use and that the key figures in the Mexican drug trade have either been killed or captured. We've done this before, the president says. Think bin Laden in Pakistan, and don't kid yourselves in any way, shape or form. This operation is of similar importance to the American people. But sir, says Brown, much of the cartel infrastructure is based in cities or towns, built-up areas with a high concentration of civilians. Military action of this nature would result in a potentially huge loss of life, collateral damage that will be hard to justify, no matter how worthy the cause. Risky it might be, but Biden knows he has to bring down the Mexican drug cartels as quickly as he plans. Ultimately, it would give him the kind of political leverage that might just see him cling onto the keys of the White House in the upcoming elections. Make no mistake, Biden is staking his political legacy on the success of this operation. Let's proceed as planned. Let's do some good, people. Hour 2. Fort Huachuca has been put on a state of high alert. Personnel are now priming the Hellfire missiles on squadrons of drones, which will shortly be launched against the drug facilities within range. Each drone will be armed with the AGM-114 Hellfire air-to-surface missile, ASM. Originally designed for anti-armor use, they were later developed for precision drone strikes against other target types, especially high-value targets, just like the drug manufacturing facilities in Mexico. This multi-mission, multi-target precision strike ability means that the missiles can be launched from multiple air, sea, and ground platforms, making Fort Huachuca the perfect location to initiate the surprise attack. To ensure optimal devastation, the drones will be launched in mini-squadrons of 20 in number. When in range, the laser-guided AGM-114L longbow Hellfire missiles will be deployed. Nothing within the vicinity is likely to survive a direct hit. Hour 6. The first wave of drones is launched. In a series of well-coordinated attacks, the Hellfire missiles successfully target the drug cartel infrastructure, decimating dozens of buildings and reducing whole streets to nothing more than dust and rubble. Reports from Mexican troops on the ground paint a picture of utmost carnage and chaos. Whole neighborhoods have been leveled. Dead bodies are strewn across the blood-soaked streets. Fires rage, sirens wail. Not that there is much that the paramedics who arrive at the scene can do for those maimed and seriously injured. Reports of thousands of casualties from each town and city are starting to reach media outlets across Mexico and beyond. The attacks are devastating and effective. One cartel after another has been effectively wiped off the face of the earth. But at what cost? Like Brown had predicted back at the Oval Office, the cartels are far from stupid. They deliberately operate out of big cities and towns he mentioned in heavily built-up areas to nullify the possibility of such an attack. They know that no government could initiate a full-blown offensive if the loss of innocent lives would be so high. Biden has called their bluff. The sudden nature and ferociousness of the attacks have taken the cartels by surprise. For that reason, they have suffered irrecoverable losses, both in terms of manpower, infrastructure, and product. While the drug manufacturing facilities may have been primitive, they were incredibly effective, with some working around the clock. Billions of dollars of refined opioids destined for the American market have been destroyed. Great chemical clouds of smoke hang over the site of each decimated building. Visibility is negligible, and the air is barely breathable. Round 1 to Biden and the Mexican government. Hour 12. Heavy artillery moves in on the ground. Mexican AMX-13, T-55 and T-72 tanks and hundreds of troops, ably supported by US Rangers, Green Berets, Marine or Delta Force regiments, aim to secure each targeted area and ensure that any hostile threat has been neutralized. At first, this appeared to be no more than a reconnaissance mission, with troops confirming that different sectors of different towns and cities were safe and reporting back to their superiors, but that didn't prove to be the case. As each unit picked its way through the rubble, they met with incredible and unforeseen resistance. Although fully unprepared for the attack, the surviving cartel members have somehow managed to galvanize themselves into a scattered fighting force. Equipped with armored trucks with 50 caliber machine guns and their own grenade-dropping drones, the severely depleted forces scramble to launch wave after wave of attack. As a result, the Mexican and US troops have to dig in and take defensive positions. With far superior manpower and resources, they see this as the only momentary setback and fully expect to continue their advance in due course. However, as US snipers get into position and begin to return fire, they soon realize that they are shooting at no more than heavily armed children. "Sir," one of the commanding officers reports back to base, "we have a slight problem on the ground here and need some clarification from our superiors before proceeding with the mission." For the drug cartels, no tactic, however preposterous or underhand, is off the table. They have routinely used child soldiers as young as 11 to further their operational goals. Whether patrolling the drug-making facilities or intimidating the local populace, kids who should rightly have been playing in parks are now toting semi-automatic weapons and tossing grenades at one of the most advanced armies in the world. The killing of children, even in a war against drugs, wouldn't look good for Biden in an election year. When the president is made aware of the fact in the White House Situation Room, he sits in studied silence for a full minute, maybe more. He no doubt visualizes the headlines in the morning papers and hears the bulletins on all the major news channels, but he's gone too far to pull out now. Ever since he took office, he's read one report after another enumerating the drug-related deaths directly attributable to the Mexican cartels. He knows it's a cliché, and he knows that it may well not save his job, but in some situations, tough decisions simply have to be made. In some situations, as inhumane as it may sound, the ends really do justify the means. "Continue with the mission," he informs his staff. "Let's get this thing done and dusted today." Hour 18. Having slowly but surely overcome the fierce resistance on the ground, Mexican and US troops have now secured each and every sector of each and every targeted area. Of the few local people who survived the first drone onslaught, then the ground assault, they stagger from the remnants of the decimated buildings, bloodied and beaten, and either waving improvised white flags or raising their hands in surrender. As the medical teams rush over to assist them, one word in Spanish resonates above all others: gracias. As much as the troops are moved by this simple gesture, as much as they realize that they've contributed to removing these people from out under the tyranny of the drug cartels, it's a bittersweet victory. So many victims, many of them children, are testament to the true cost of the operation. Hour 24. Biden calls a press conference at the White House. In the James S. Brady press briefing room, the president informs an unexpected world of the news that the US, in cooperation with the Mexican government, launched a bold and decisive attack at the very heart of the Mexican drug cartels. Ladies and gentlemen, we got them. We finally got them. The press contingent looks on in confusion. None have been briefed regarding the true nature and scale of the operation. "Shortly after I came into office," Biden continues, "I read a report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Do you know how many deaths were directly linked to the illegal opioids that have flooded into our country from Mexico? Well, let me tell you, 100,306. No more. We've just taken a huge step in finally winning the war on drugs." Biden is seen as a hero and his actions lauded across the globe. Of course, this scenario is just one of many ways the US military could potentially wreck the Mexican drug cartels. In reality, however, the American government would face many legal problems in launching any such attack, not to mention fierce opposition in Congress. Firstly, they would have to redefine the status of the drug cartels through the US courts, but this could conceivably be overcome in quite a straightforward manner. By designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, Biden would be legally entitled to deploy military force to overcome the drug problems posed by Mexico. This may not be the most popular or welcome of moves, though. If the drug cartels were designated as FTOs, it would have a potentially crippling effect on the Mexican economy. Some experts estimate that it could hit the tourist sector to the tune of $20 billion, or 8.5% of its GDP. Why? Quite simply, people would be scared of traveling to a country riddled with terroristic elements. Other economic arguments are just as compelling. Trade between the US and Mexico alone is worth $72.1 billion. Eye-watering figures that illustrate exactly how much is at stake here. But at what point does the social cost of the opioid crisis in the US outweigh the economic ramifications of war on the Mexican drug cartels? We've already provided some chilling statistics at the top of the video, but perhaps it pays to dig deeper to paint an even starker picture of the crisis. As mentioned earlier in the video, both countries are well aware of the scale of the issue and the human cost involved in the opioid crisis, even if, historically, the US has been reluctant to intervene militarily to not worsen its already shaky relationship with Mexico. Inherent issues which can be traced back to the Mexican-American War of 1846–48. With the other conflicts that are raging around the world at present, most notably Russia's brutal attempts to annex Ukraine, López Obrador may fear a similar fate. But any notion of the US carving up the country and taking over is, of course, mere conjecture. What can't be denied are the many legal rumblings that have taken place in recent years. Following the death of US nationals in Mexico, Senator Lindsey Graham, co-sponsored by Senators John Kennedy, Marsha Blackburn, Josh Hawley, Steve Daines, Mike Lee, and Mike Brown, introduced the Ending the Narcos Act of 2023 to the United States Senate, or to give it its full name, Ending the Notorious, Aggressive, and Remorseless Criminal Organizations and Syndicates Act. Following on from a previous point, the purpose of this act was to designate Mexican cartels and other transnational criminal organizations as FTOs. The reasoning behind this is that these organizations pose significant threats to US citizens due to their involvement in acts of terrorism, including the production and importation of illicit substances such as fentanyl. Again, the ultimate aim was to enable the US to tackle this threat with the kind of extreme military force described earlier in the video. And it would be remiss not to mention the migrant crisis. Everyone remembers Donald Trump's infamous Build a Wall speech from his successful presidential campaign back in 2016. In a BBC report from 2022, there were a record 239,416 encounters between illegal migrants and US law enforcement at the Mexico border. And while Biden has attempted to address the issue by offering legal status to an estimated 11 million undocumented people in the US, his proposal failed to gain enough bipartisan support to pass into law. Conservative critics have been outraged by what they see as being soft on the border. And the figures back this up, with a significant spike in number during Biden's term in office, something which could prove critical if, as expected, he faces off against Trump again in the upcoming election. And if all that wasn't bad enough, there's an even more sinister geopolitical subplot to our story: China. As highlighted earlier, Beijing is known to be supplying the ingredients that make up fentanyl to the Mexican drug cartels. The natural question is why? What does China get out of aiding and abetting criminal organizations? Instability, thousands of deaths each year, a general weakening of the social structure across vast swathes of America. The list could go on. But there is historical precedence, if not a justification for China's stance here. The country sees fentanyl as revenge for what it calls the century of humiliation and the opium wars of the 1830s and 40s. These kinds of tactics, therefore, can be seen as a historically based foreign policy to ensure that China remains strong and its enemies weak. Case in point, China had suspended cooperation with the United States on drug policies in 2023, but agreed to resume bilateral cooperation in January 2024. Undoubtedly, there's a much bigger picture here to consider, one that would take up one, if not several more videos to cover in its entirety. But if there is one underlying factor that's stopping the US from deploying military force against the Mexican drug cartels, it's the dreaded possibility of mission creep. In so many conflicts of recent years, and we can go back to Vietnam and beyond, the US has deployed forces in a region for what it initially saw as a short-term basis to achieve its military aims, be that to stabilize a country or gain a geopolitical foothold in a region crucial to US interests abroad. All too often, this has led to years of attritional fighting, and in the case of Vietnam and Afghanistan, embarrassing and costly withdrawals, with the country in question being in a much worse situation than it was before. The last thing Biden or whoever happens to occupy the White House in the future wants is a long, drawn-out, painful, bloody war in Mexico. For that reason alone, any military action against the drug cartels is highly unlikely now or in the short to medium term. Just quite how the US solves the opioid crisis and gains an upper hand in the war on drugs remains to be seen. But perhaps the words of former Guatemalan leader Otto Pérez Molina, a paraphrase from a famous Albert Einstein quote, sums up the situation most succinctly. We cannot continue doing the same thing and expect different results. Now we're coming to the end of the video, and it's time to ask you what you think about the opioid crisis in America and how the government should respond. Do you think the problem is so serious that some kind of military intervention is inevitable? Or do you think the economic factors highlighted in this video make military action all but impossible? And what of the bigger geopolitical picture? Can the US sit back as China floods its towns and cities with highly addictive substances like fentanyl? It's certainly a tough call for whoever will be sitting in the White House come November, but sadly, it's not a problem that's going to go away on its own. If America doesn't act now, it may well be counting the cost for generations to come. Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels. or click this other video instead. Right next door to the US, a relentless war unfolds, a battle that has raged since December 2006, when Mexico declared war on its powerful drug cartels. These are no ordinary criminals. They command armies, control territories, and fight over access to the lucrative drug pathway into the US, a nation grappling with an insatiable demand for narcotics. This violent saga began under President Calderón, who deployed 6,500 soldiers to Michoacán, sparking a conflict that shows no signs of abating almost 2 decades later. These cartels extend their influence deep into the political fabric, corrupting officials in Mexico and the US. Meanwhile, a dark alliance forms with the Chinese Communist Party, supplying the cartels with the means to produce fentanyl, a scourge on American streets that's slashing life expectancy. In the face of this growing threat, the Texas Rangers took decisive action in October 2023 at one of the most notorious trafficking hotspots along the US-Mexico border. But who are these modern-day Rangers, and what drastic steps did they take to stem the tide of organized crime? As we delve into this gritty saga, we explore the strategic moves and their broader impact on the ongoing border crisis that has ensnared the United States since 2021. Let's unravel the complex web of conflict and courage in this relentless border saga. The Texas Rangers are one of the oldest police organizations in the United States and the oldest law enforcement organization with statewide jurisdiction on the North American continent. The unit originated in 1823 when Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, organized a paramilitary group to provide protection for the 600 to 700 American families who had colonized the area on invitation from the Spanish government, which then ruled Mexico, of which Texas was a part. Because these troops needed to range over broad tracts of land, they were called Rangers. This body of troops became more permanent in the 1830s, as the then self-proclaimed Republic of Texas had tensions with the newly independent Mexico. Defenders were needed at the border and against attacks by Native Americans, and the Rangers were designed to carry out both these tasks. Clashes with the Native Americans were far more frequent than the more dramatic battles with Mexico, and the Rangers continued in this service after joining the Union and officially being recognized as part of the United States following the Mexican-American War. In a convention held on January 28, 1861, Texas seceded from the Union. The Rangers did not officially participate in the American Civil War, but many of the men who made up the unit did. Terry's Texas Rangers, named after its commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin Franklin Terry, was organized later that year and fought as part of the Confederate Army. Nevertheless, the Union won the war, Texas was occupied, and the Rangers were temporarily disbanded during Reconstruction. They were instead re-regimented as the state police under the Reconstruction-era government. But after Reconstruction ended in 1873, following the previous year's highly disputed presidential election, the Rangers were reconstituted. As the frontier closed, the Rangers gradually shifted from being a paramilitary group to getting involved in investigative and police work. In 1935, about a century after their foundation, the transition was made official, as the Rangers were folded into the newly created Texas Department of Public Safety. In this capacity, they act as the State Bureau of Investigation, Texas's equivalent to the FBI. In October 2023, amid the ongoing border crisis, the Texas Rangers turned their attention to Fronton Island in the Rio Grande. This island is newly formed and did not exist when the Rangers were created. The river cut a new channel between 1852 and 1926 that gradually separated this piece of real estate from the mainland. As this separation came after the Mexican-American War and Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there were some disputes as to the nationality of this new island. The 1848 treaty set the Rio Grande as the border between the two countries. Land north of the river was considered American territory, with the south bank being Mexican. The channel that created the island split cut it off from the mainland to the north. Did this mean that it was now part of Mexico? For decades, this question was left in legal limbo, and both sides largely stayed clear of the island. However, the issue was settled in 1976. That year, the International Boundary and Water Commission, which was created in 1889 by the United States and Mexico to handle any future territorial issues, recognized Fronton as American territory, in line with a new treaty between the two countries that came into force in 1970. Fronton Island is today considered part of Texas's Starr County. Fronton Island is uninhabited. It has a length of about 2 miles and a total area of about 160 acres. The island is largely flat, with a highest elevation of 177 feet. As nobody lives on the island, no one was around to control the growth of fauna, and thick vegetation covered it at the time of the raid. Also, because nobody lives there, Fronton Island did not have a high profile. Government agents on both sides of the border tended not to go there in order to prevent any international disputes, even after the questions about its ownership were settled in the 70s. As early as the 1980s, the island showed its potential as a stronghold for criminal activity. On June 10, 1983, 7 convicts were working in a prison yard on the Mexican side of the border. Sensing an opportunity, the criminals used their tools to attack a guard, striking him in the head. They then took his weapon, escaped through a gate that had been opened for a lumber delivery, and fled to Fronton Island. 3 of the men were being held in connection with the murders of 2 Mexican federal police officers. Authorities from both sides of the border cooperated in their attempts to arrest the fugitives, but it wasn't an easy task. The dense foliage on Fronton Island made surveillance and intelligence gathering nearly impossible. Helicopter observation proved nearly useless. 3 of the fugitives were not apprehended until the 12th. Reports on the other 4 are difficult to find. The vegetation on Fronton Island makes it ideal not only for hiding people, but for the cartel to conceal their illicit cargoes. The Rio Grande is also shallow in this area and relatively easy to cross compared to the deeper areas elsewhere. To make the island even more desirable as a transit point, there is a well-established road network near the river crossing on the Mexican side of the border, making it easy for the cartels to move their wares. All of these factors made Fronton Island a perfect place to act as a hotspot for organized crime, and the Mexican drug cartels have long used it as a transit point for narcotics, weapons, and human trafficking. To combat these trends and the massive surge in border crossings, the state of Texas launched Operation Lone Star in March 2021. The mission's objective was to deter illegal immigration and the trafficking in weapons and narcotics across the border by the cartels. It began with Governor Abbott's disaster declaration in 53 counties in the state that month. Such a declaration gave him the authority to deploy the Texas National Guard to the border. Operation Lone Star is a joint effort between the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Texas Military Department, which the State National Guard falls under. Texas's governor's office claims that as of March 2024, Operation Lone Star has resulted in the apprehension of over 500,000 people crossing the border, over 40,000 criminal arrests, 36,000 of which were felony arrests, and the seizure of 469 million doses of fentanyl. However, independent investigations have revealed that at least 2,000 of these arrests had no clear link to Operation Lone Star, casting doubt on some of the other numbers. Nevertheless, a year after it started, Operation Lone Star began to show results. Illegal entries into Texas did increase between March 21 and March 22, but at a rate of 6.9% compared to the 36.3% in Arizona, 30% in California, and 47% in New Mexico. But the challenges continue. In the spring of 2023, the Biden administration declared an end to the COVID-19 related state of emergency in the United States. One of the consequences of this declaration was the end of enforcement of Title 42, the public health-related ordinance that allowed for easier removal of people crossing the border. Governor Abbott responded to the anticipated increase by requesting the assistance of other states through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which makes it easier for states to assist one another with resources in the wake of a disaster. 14 Republican-controlled states responded to the request, with Florida sending the most personnel at about 1,100. Activity along Fronton Island increased throughout 2023, and as part of Operation Lone Star, the Texas Land Commissioner, Dawn Buckingham, authorized the Department of Public Safety to patrol the area on September 7th. This paved the way for the raid the following month. The raid had recent precedent. 2 islands 90 miles to the northwest, near the Eagles Pass border crossing hotspot, were seized earlier by the Texas Department of Public Safety. Deterring illegal border crossings was the purpose behind the earlier raids, which gave the Texas Rangers operational experience in taking control of these small islands. On October 9th, the Texas Rangers launched their raid. Before doing so, they secured cooperation with their Mexican counterparts across the border, although doing this came with its own dangers. Seizing a series of structures built by the cartels was the first purpose of the raid. Doing so would restore operational control of Fronton Island to the state of Texas. Law enforcement on the island had been so lax that the cartels were marking these buildings with their symbols as their territory, and this was done for a reason. Fronton not only sits on the boundaries between the United States and Mexico, but on the border between the Gulf Cartel and the Cartel del Noreste, which has been allied to the Los Zetas cartel. The cartels therefore not only fought with American and Mexican law enforcement in the area, but with each other. To prove the point, some of the buildings were riddled with bullet holes from firefights between the rival cartels, and indeed, surveillance footage showed armed cartel personnel patrolling the island. The buildings were built on the island's high points to give the cartels an advantageous field of fire. The cartels were so brazen on the island that they at times fired on American law enforcement across the channel in the river. They shot at people on the southern side too. On September 9th, 2 days after Buckingham's authorization for the Texas Rangers to move on the island, a caravan of 20 people, 16 Mexicans and 4 Americans, came under attack near the island. 3 people were wounded in the incident. Essentially, this area in the United States territory was being militarized as part of the cartel's burgeoning narco polities extending from the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. This is one of the most dangerous areas in Mexico, and the US State Department has placed it on its Do Not Travel list. That it sits right across the border is a demonstration of just how chaotic things are down there. Operation Lone Star sought to restore operational control of this dangerous island to the United States and the state of Texas. Governor Abbott ordered his state security services to take the island and hold it, come what may. To clear Fronton Island out, the Texas Rangers needed to conduct this operation in a highly militarized fashion. The men who took part in the raid looked like they could have been members of the regular US Army, as they wore full camouflage and body armor while carrying military-grade weapons. Nevertheless, the location of the island necessitated restrictive rules of engagement. The Rangers were not to fire upon anyone unless they were shot at first, for fear of sparking an international incident. Fortunately, the Rangers had the help of drones. The operation began with drone surveillance. This was likely far more effective than the helicopter surveillance of the island had been in 1983, thanks to higher resolution cameras, thermal imaging, and drones being far less detectable, although we're only making an educated guess about this. As noted, the Mexican Federal Police cooperated with the Rangers in the operation. Their task was to cut off entry to the island from the south bank of the Rio Grande. Unfortunately, because the cartels have infiltrated the machinery of the Mexican government at every level of administration and in every agency, the participation of Mexican law enforcement from their side of the Rio Grande likely meant that the cartels were tipped off about the Rangers' operation. The Rangers were undoubtedly aware of this, but nevertheless acted in a way to achieve maximum surprise. They began their raid at the crack of dawn. In another show of how dangerous the island had become, the Rangers needed to be wary not only of small arms fire coming from the elevated perches, but of improvised explosive devices. Officers warned their men not to disturb backpacks or piles of clothes for fear they might be booby-trapped. And indeed, law enforcement officers had once found an IED amid stashes of rifles and ammunition. Fortunately, the Rangers found nobody on the island during their raid. The cartel members who got wind of the operation decided to flee rather than put up a fight. The participating Rangers posed with the flag of Texas to send the message that they had retaken Fronton. However, this was only the first phase of the operation. The island had been recaptured. Now the state of Texas needed to effectively occupy it. The day after the raid, the National Guard and Texas Department of Public Safety began to fortify Fronton to prevent access to it from the Mexican side of the border. Once the Rangers declared the island to be clear of hostiles, the Texas National Guard began construction. These fortifications included over 1.5 miles of razor wire. The National Guard also began to clear the vegetation on the island. This act raised objections from a few quarters. The growth of fauna on Fronton Island had helped it to become a de facto wildlife sanctuary. Scientific experts also warned that clearing the island of vegetation would bring a local environmental disaster. Betty Perez, a local botanist, said of the plan, "That's what's holding these islands down, the vegetation. We're heading into times when there are big storms. That island will just sort of blow away, and then the silt will end up going down the river and causing more damage." Despite the danger, Texas officials were determined to continue clearing the vegetation on the island. Buckingham responded that the environmentalists should get a real concern and that securing Fronton was necessary for the state of Texas to achieve its goal of having complete operational control of the border. Patrols of the area continue, but because of a shortage of personnel and a vast border to patrol in far busier sectors, these will only have limited effectiveness. Texas's Operation Lone Star has also faced legal challenges, as immigration policy is constitutionally in the federal domain, not the state one. The clashes between the state and federal authority came to the forefront in January 2024, when agents from Texas and other states fortified Shelby Park in Eagle Pass in the same manner that they had fortified Fronton a few months earlier. The objective of this effort, according to Governor Abbott, was to protect the sovereignty of the state of Texas. Extensive razor wire barriers were constructed in the park to prevent illegal border crossings. The Biden administration immediately raised a legal challenge and demanded that Border Patrol agents regain access to the park in order to process the people who had crossed the border. A lower court ruling sided with Texas and prevented federal authorities from cutting the razor wire that Texas had set up. This ruling was later reversed in a 5-4 decision by the US Supreme Court, but the ruling was ambiguous. The feds were allowed to remove the fortifications in Eagle Pass, but the ruling did not say that Texas could not construct more of them. The standoff has therefore continued. This is why securing control of the border will be much harder for Texas to do than capturing an uninhabited island in the river, and the limitations of the raid on Fronton became clear shortly afterward. Drone and hidden ground camera footage released a month after the operation on Fronton Island revealed that squads of armed cartel members were patrolling the same border area. The cartels were no longer on the island, but there was no evidence that the raid had seriously damaged their ability to continue their illegal traffic, even in the same sector along the border. Indeed, other officials warned at the time of the raid that the cartels would simply move their activities elsewhere. This is certain, but depriving them of Fronton Island's tactical advantages and legal ambiguity was the right move. The cartels will certainly have another area from which to conduct their activities, but the alternative might not be as advantageous for them as Fronton was. The border crisis and all that comes with it shows no signs of abating. The Texas border with Mexico is over 1,200 miles long. Trying to stop illicit activity along such a stretch will always in some way be a game of whack-a-mole. The cartels can take advantage of this by rerouting their activities to places that are less heavily patrolled. There are also parts of the border that are nearly impossible to patrol in a systematic way thanks to natural obstacles. Meanwhile, the population centers on both sides of the border do not perfectly align with one another. A heavily populated area south of the border can act as an easy staging point for the cartels to smuggle their human and material cargoes across to a deserted part of the northern side that is physically hard to patrol or which has no infrastructure like border barriers. The best way to mitigate this is through cooperation with the Mexican authorities in the population center on the southern side, but that's not guaranteed. Even if it was, the cartel's infiltration of Mexico's security services will often mean that they will be tipped off in advance and reroute their activities, making it an imperfect solution at best. With these factors and legal challenges sure to continue against Operation Lone Star, Texas is in many ways behind the eight ball. Despite the success of the raid on Fronton, the crisis of organized crime on the US southern border won't end anytime soon. What do you think about the raid on Fronton Island and the broader Operation Lone Star effort? Is there a way for Texas to make its efforts more effective? Can the increased use of drones in the air and on water eventually become a game changer in the battle against the cartels? And what operation might Texas Rangers carry out next? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels. Or click this other video instead. In 2015, the murder rate in El Salvador hit a record high, at 103 homicides per 100,000 people. This made it the most dangerous country on Earth. American media outlets gave it a grim headline, the murder capital of the world. Since then, the figures have dropped. Upon taking power in 2019, President Nayib Bukele made controlling the country's gangs, which were responsible for the murders, his highest priority. However, his methods have proven controversial among the international community. When he took office in June 2019, El Salvador's homicide rate was still 35.8 per 100,000 people, still the world's homicide leader. In 2023, the country's homicide rate was 2.4 per 100,000 people, a rate lower than the United States and a rate that is the second lowest in the Western Hemisphere, behind only Canada. Perhaps the ultimate proof of El Salvador's new safe status is that fewer of its nationals are being caught trying to cross the United States southern border, with a 37% drop in apprehensions between 2022 and 23. Indeed, many Salvadorans are now leaving the United States to return to their homeland. How did this huge turnaround happen so rapidly, and why have some of Bukele's methods proven controversial enough for some to call him a dictator in the making? Let's find out. El Salvador's gang problems originate with the country's civil war between 1979 and 1992. During that war, which saw American aid to prop up the government against leftist guerrillas, almost half the Salvadoran population fled, mostly to the United States. The new arrivals were concentrated in Southern California. Living in exile, Salvadoran teenagers could only find security and comfort with each other, forming the nexus of the MS-13 and 18th Street gangs. These gang members were often deported to El Salvador during the Clinton administration's crackdown on illegal immigration and on criminal aliens in particular. The deportations brought the gangs back to their country of origin. Many other gang members remained or snuck back into the United States, and soon the Salvadoran gangs became true transnational criminal organizations. To make matters worse, the United States and international human rights NGOs pressured the post-war Salvadoran government into passing laws that made it harder to control gang activity. One of the most important of these measures was making it illegal to bring criminal charges to anyone under the age of 18. As the gangs originated among Salvadoran teenagers and frequently recruited teenagers to carry out their criminal tasks, such legal regimes only encouraged their growth. By 2019, international media sources estimated El Salvador to have about 60,000 gang members. 2015 was a fateful year for more than one reason. As El Salvador became the most dangerous country in the world by far, that was also the year Nayib Bukele became the country's prominent political figure, securing his election as the mayor of San Salvador, the country's capital. He was then a member of the leftist FMLN party, the former guerrilla group during the Civil War. But perhaps tellingly, Bukele was expelled from the party in 2017, even as he initiated a number of popular safety and public works initiatives in the city. 2 years later, Bukele only got his name placed on the presidential ballot after complicated political maneuvering. The two traditional major parties, FMLN and the right-wing Arena Party, had attempted to block his candidacy. He was nevertheless successful and elected with 53% of the vote. He was sworn into office on June 1, 2019. Only 20 days later, Bukele revealed the major focus of his presidency by announcing his territorial control plan, and this plan revealed a level of military involvement in domestic matters that would make most people in more developed countries uncomfortable. Phase 1 of the TCP, known as Preparation, included 4,000 soldiers from the armed forces of El Salvador working alongside 2,000 officers of the country's national civil police. These soldiers and their police comrades were deployed to retake control of the city centers of 12 municipalities in El Salvador that were known to have heavy gang activity. A crackdown began on the country's prisons as well, which were notorious for becoming little more than command and control centers for the gangs. Visitation rights were suspended, high-ranking gang members were transferred to stricter confinement, cell phone signals were blocked. The objective was to disrupt the gang's CNC, and it showed promise. In this phase, and other aspects of the TCP, Bukele was building on historical precedent. One of his predecessors, Antonio Saca, implemented a policy known as Supermano Dura, which allowed El Salvador's military to patrol areas under the control of the country's gangs and make searches and arrests on suspected gang members, including based on appearance alone. As gang members often adorn themselves with related tattoos, this approach was not as random as it might seem. If the first phase of the TCP was a stick, Bukele also offered carrots with the second phase called Opportunity, which was designed to secure young people a path for a future that did not involve the gangs. These provisions included new schools, sports centers, vocational training facilities, and so on. Phase 3's approach to the TCP, called Modernization, dovetailed with the first. This phase was announced in August 2019 and included equipping El Salvador's military and police forces with modern weapons, vehicles, helicopters, night vision equipment, body armor, and other provisions. The passage of the financing needed to purchase this equipment was controversial and involved Bukele walking into the legislative building with soldiers and riot police in an effort to put public pressure on legislators. Ultimately, it failed, but Bukele mobilized an additional 1,400 soldiers to continue and expand earlier parts of the TCP. Although controversial at home and abroad, there were early signs that Bukele's renewed crackdown on gangs was working. Murders decreased by nearly 50% during his first year in office, plunging from almost 2,400 in 2019 to 1,341 in 2020. Later that year, Bukele's party won 56 seats in the country's legislative elections, which gave him much greater leeway in passing his anti-gang initiatives. Even so, in 2021, El Salvador's murder rate was 18.1 per 100,000, which still made it one of the world's 20 most dangerous countries. Despite the undeniable progress made since 2015 and the measures Bukele took to accelerate that progress, El Salvador's gang violence proved persistently stubborn, and in September 2020, a report in the Central American publication El Faro suggested that the reduction in murders during his first year was not only attributable to Bukele's TCP, rather the president reportedly offered MS-13 improved prison conditions in exchange for a reduction of murders on their part and the gang's support for his Nuevas Ideas party in upcoming legislative elections. The United States Treasury Department later accused Bukele of this as well. Bukele denied these reports and accused El Faro of money laundering, which forced the publication to relocate its headquarters to Costa Rica. Bukele also initiated the next phase of the TCP, which he called Incursion. Incursion involved a much heavier military presence in areas which were controlled by the gangs and which the police were too scared to enter, no-go zones. Bukele announced his intention to double the size of El Salvador's armed forces from 20,000 to 40,000 as part of this plan. Then something extraordinary happened. El Salvador's murder rate decreased by almost 57% in a year, with 651 fewer murders between 2021's 1,147 and 2022's 496. The trend continued between 2022 and 23, with the latter only having 154 homicides, a further 69% reduction. How did this come about? Unfortunately, the beginning is a dark story. For a while, incursion was working, then came retaliation. Between March 25th and 27th, 2022, 87 people in El Salvador were killed by MS-13 gang members who randomly shot at targets in the streets. These killings were unusual, as the gangs did not tend to commit random acts of violence, but rather retaliations for people running afoul of their extortion rackets or some other offense. 62 people were killed on the 25th alone. It was the deadliest single day in El Salvador since that country's civil war. In particular, MS-13 was attempting to retaliate in response to the government's crackdown on 2 bus routes in San Salvador. The gang had typically extorted revenue from the traffic on these bus routes, and the government wanted to cut this source of revenue off as part of the incursion phase of the TCP. To further warn Bukele and his government, the gangs left a string of corpses on the road to the elite beachfront neighborhood called Surf City, an area that the president had devoted a lot of resources to in a bid to attract international tourism. On March 27th, El Salvador's Legislative Assembly held an emergency session which passed the country's current state of exception. This provision was originally supposed to last for 30 days, but it's been extended ever since. El Salvador's constitution permits states of exception to be passed which temporarily suspend certain rights. These include freedom of assembly, the right to be informed of the reasons behind arrest and detention, time limits to detention, protections for the privacy of communications, and protections against compelled testimony. With these tools in hand, the government began an all-encompassing gang crackdown that extended in and outside of prisons. Meals for imprisoned gang members were reduced, both as a cost-cutting measure and as a warning. Bukele threatened that gang members' retaliation against civilians would result in all food being cut to their homeboys in prison. He said they would not get a single grain of rice, and in response to international criticism, claimed that the NGOs could have all the gang members they wanted. Bukele's government made life more miserable for imprisoned gang members by taking away clothes, reducing them to their underwear, and removing their mattresses, forcing them to sleep on concrete. In the outside world, gang members actual or suspected were rounded up and arrested en masse. Over 56,000 arrests were made before the end of 2022, a number which covers nearly the entire 2019 estimate of El Salvador's total gang population. Arrests were made without warrants or access to legal counsel for those detained. Previous rights to a court hearing within 72 hours were also suspended as part of the state of exception. These mass arrests involved the Salvadoran army in a new way and coincided with the passage of the 5th phase of the TCP called extraction. In this phase, the Salvadoran military worked side by side with the police in encircling neighborhoods where gang members were suspected of hiding. The soldiers and cops then checked every house and every person. Anyone suspected of gang affiliation, even with little evidence, was rounded up and imprisoned. To ensure the necessary capacity, the Salvadoran government built a new mega-prison in 2022, one capable of housing up to 40,000 inmates, according to government estimates. Outside sources are more modest, claiming the complex can hold a maximum of 20,000 people. Either way, it's the largest prison in Latin America. The construction of the new prison, called the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, came on the heels of a new 5,000 inmate facility in 2021. It's situated 46 miles southeast of San Salvador. The prison is composed of 8 buildings that house 32 cells that can hold more than 100 people each. Official footage from the prison reveals that each of these cells has only 2 sinks and 1 toilet. El Salvador's prison population, which had already been growing, spiked dramatically as a result of this crackdown. In January 2024, El Salvador had 1,086 prison inmates per 100,000 people. The country now houses over 105,000 prisoners, or over 1% of its population. This rate is the highest in the world. To put this further into perspective, in 2020, the country's total prison capacity was estimated to be a little higher than 27,000. Despite the new complexes, El Salvador's prisons remain overcrowded, and they will be more crowded because gang-related detentions now result in much longer stints behind bars. The prisoners are also isolated from the outside world. They have reportedly been unable to communicate with attorneys or other organizations that might be able to advocate for them. Undoubtedly, the Salvadoran government fears that re-establishing such communications will enable gangs to use prisons as headquarters like they had for so many years before. But for Bukele, it was not enough to confine the gangs into highly secure prison complexes. Their presence in Salvadoran society needed to be completely exercised, in mental as well as in physical terms. In November 2022, Bukele ordered prison inmates to destroy gang imagery on tombstones in the country's cemeteries, starting with those near San Salvador. This measure came over and above previous measures to remove graffiti from city centers throughout the country and was in compliance with the gang proscription law passed by the country's legislature. When responding to international criticism, Bukele compared these efforts to the success of the Allies' denazification efforts in Germany after the end of World War II. Gang symbols are not allowed anywhere, not in graffiti, not at home, not on people's bodies, not on people's graves. Take the case of Germany, for example. When the Allied forces beat the Nazis in Germany, a large number of Germans were of course still Nazis. So to denazify Germany, they took several aggressive measures that are still in place today in German law. One such measure, for example, is that swastikas are banned. All Nazi symbols, not just the swastika, all of them, but especially that one, that is the best known, are banned in Germany. They aren't banned in the United States, nor are they banned in El Salvador, because we never had any problem with Nazism. In our case, of course, I personally find swastikas offensive, but we have never had that problem here. So we don't have to actively crack down on swastikas, but it's a problem they had in Germany, so they banned it. And not just on paper, they went on to destroy all Nazi symbols anywhere in the country. Anything that had Nazi symbols had to be destroyed, including tombstones. Why? Because to break something that was so interwoven in German society, it wasn't enough just to arrest the Nazi leaders and kill them. They also had to erase all Nazi ideology from German society. Here in El Salvador, thank God we never had a Nazi problem, but we did have a gang problem. It's a similar issue, because they haven't just done us so much harm like the Nazis, they haven't just been ruthless like the Nazis, they haven't just been cruel like the Nazis, but they were also interwoven in Salvadoran society. El Salvador's legislature even passed a law preventing the media from reporting on gang-related stories. Under this law, journalists can face prison terms of 10 years if they use gang sources for their stories. Meanwhile, under the state of exception, the Salvadoran government can access the communications of all civilians in the country. The military equipment purchased under the modernization phase of the TCP has likely been used as part of this mass surveillance. Despite the intrusiveness, the measures continue to work. In 2024, murder rates in El Salvador are on track to decline further. Before the start of the year, and March 23rd, there were 22 homicides. If this trend continues, El Salvador would end the year with a homicide rate of 1.5 per 100,000 people. This would see it fall below Canada and become the safest country in the Americas and one of the safest in the world. Bukele's government is committed to seeing this through. In late March, there were 2 murders in northern El Salvador. The perpetrators were members of the Barrio 18 Serenos gang. The response from the government was swift. 5,000 soldiers from the Salvadoran army were mobilized alongside 1,000 police officers. These men surrounded a perimeter with San Jose Cancasque, San Isidro Labrador, San Antonio Los Ranchos, and Potonicho as the 4 respective corners. Soldiers and police then entered the perimeter to dismantle the centers of gang activity and round up the murderers' associates. Bukele vowed in a tweet that the area would become the safest place in the safest country throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. The explainer video he posted likewise vowed that the country's security forces would not rest until the few remaining aspects of the gangs in El Salvador were wiped out. The United States government, the European Union, international organizations like the UN and Organization for American States, and human rights NGOs like Amnesty International have long been critics of Bukele, accusing his presidency as coinciding with democratic backsliding and growing authoritarianism in El Salvador. Before 2022 ended, these NGOs claimed that Bukele's government had committed several thousand human rights violations, including at least 80 deaths of those in the custody of the Salvadoran authorities. By April 2023, the number had grown to 153, and supposedly none of these inmates had been convicted of a crime. People who have been released from their prisons have also reported on the cruel conditions within them. While file footage of prisoners being herded together in their underwear is now commonly known, testimonies of those who have been released suggest crueler conditions not shown on camera. When speaking to the Insight Crime think tank, one of these former inmates, going by the pseudonym Diego, remarked on the severity of the guards. They would hit you for anything and everything. All day and night you'd hear the cries of people being hit by the guards. They had everyone perfectly under control. More grandly, Bukele, seeking and receiving a second consecutive 5-year term in office, has been accused both domestically and abroad of violating El Salvador's constitution. But for the Salvadoran people, Bukele is a hero. He enjoys some of the world's highest approval ratings and was re-elected with nearly 85% of the vote. Tellingly, there were no serious allegations of election rigging, as would be the case in a place like Russia or Belarus. To the general public of El Salvador, life is now far more preferable than it was under the terror of the gangs. Various sources that speak with the people in El Salvador unanimously report the sense of relief in their country. New businesses can form without the fear of being extorted. People can travel without fear of finding themselves under the control of the gangs. When speaking to the Associated Press as part of its story on the cemetery crackdown, ordinary Salvadoran citizens expressed a great deal of joy. There's a lot of happiness being able to visit relatives who have died. Before it was normal to see gang members inside the cemetery, but today there's no danger. Perhaps that best sums up the success of Bukele's anti-gang initiatives. Other countries like Ecuador and Honduras have requested advisors from El Salvador to help them tackle their own gang problems. However, El Salvador had a number of benefits, one of which was a more professional military and police force. These were effective resources for Bukele to call upon when the time came. In contrast, corruption is rampant in the militaries and police forces of other countries in the region, most notoriously in Mexico, where the cartels have infiltrated at all levels of command. The Salvadoran army's previous effectiveness was just as much responsible for the reduction in gang violence as Bukele's vision. But what do you think about President Bukele's gang crackdown in El Salvador? Will it be effective in the long term after he leaves office? Is El Salvador going through a period of democratic backsliding as the price to be paid for crushing the gangs? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels, or click this other video instead. When the Berlin Wall fell, the US stood alone as the world's leading superpower, dominating in military, economic, and political spheres. Fast forward 15 years, and there's a new challenger in town. But it might not be who you think, and this shift in global power dynamics could turn our lives upside down, but not in a good way. Let's dive in and look at what's happening to shake up the world's status quo. To truly understand the power dynamics between the world's largest economies today, we need to rewind the clock all the way back to the Cold War and find out what really makes a superpower. In the mid-20th century, the two largest economies in the world were the Soviet Union and the United States. They were creating entire geopolitical blocks in their spheres of influence and guiding economies around them. This bipolar order was entrenched with the constant threat of nuclear war. This put the superpowers at odds with one another, as both sought to wield military power and dominate the economic, scientific, and military playgrounds of the world. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia emerged as a shadow of its former economic and geopolitical self, pinning the blame for the New World Order on the West, particularly the United States. While countries such as Japan and Germany stayed in the relatively comfortable top 5 spots, it was the United States that truly won, remaining as one of the world's biggest economies and representing roughly a quarter of the entire world's total GDP. Due to the US having complete control over a huge chunk of the world's money, it could inject those funds into a peacekeeping, or rather peace-inducing, force abroad. There was no other country that could field such a large military and transport it across the world as fast as the US. This gave the world's sole superpower a truly global reach and the ability to influence others politically, ideologically, and economically. But the US largely failed in that mission, and for 3 key reasons. First, Russia was the biggest and most important successor to the Soviet Union, and it was kept firmly out of the US influence and the Western economy. Russia was stuck trying to bring back its former territorial glory, as evidenced by Russia continuously instigating conflicts in former Soviet countries and the overwhelming political and economic influence of both the US and the neighboring European Union. Ultimately, the country has made several grave tactical errors that culminated in the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a move that wiped 90% of its standing military and will likely set it back economically for the rest of the decade. Whether the West was truly responsible for Russia's downfall is up for debate, but what isn't is that the US was unable to stop Russia, despite Russia being outmatched by the US in virtually every way. The second aspect lies in China's economic and industrial leap at the start of the 21st century. The country was greatly helped by the economic influence and needs of the West. With rampant capitalism encouraging Western powers to seek lower manufacturing costs, China realized its potential as a major manufacturer, which allowed it to become the world's second largest economy by 2010. The US was under the belief that capitalistic tendencies would influence China to become more like Western nations, and in turn fall in line under the influence of the US. But the Chinese ultimately relinquished most of its ties to the West and tried to exert influence in its immediate vicinity and reclaim the territory it had previously lost. The growing conflict with Taiwan, where the US needs to keep a constant naval presence around the island China asserts is its own, has been a geopolitical sore point for China for decades. Other Indo-Pacific countries such as India, Japan, and Australia have begun relying on the US to keep the peace with China, forming an alliance called the Quad to counter it. But as China grows economically and becomes more independent of American trade, despite the two countries having more trade relations than ever, its new alliance with Russia might give China the latest push it needs to officially look into staking serious claims in its surroundings. Finally, while the US's goal was to bring democracy to other countries, its internal policies have all but led to the failure of democracy within its own borders. As the political system in the US became more and more favorable to the already rich, the wealth gap and income inequality in the country continued to increase. With the advancement of technology putting millions of Americans behind the curve as globalization makes them redundant, the US leaders are no longer the beacons of trust and hope for the common man. As such, the US has made moves towards more insular management and isolation, as evidenced by pulling a bulk of its military forces out of the Middle East in the past few years without achieving its stated goals. So we can see the US is slowly but surely losing its status as the world's sole superpower. But what effects can we already see stemming from this change, and who is emerging as the next superpower? Mounting global issues, such as the crises in North Korea, Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, are symptomatic of the problem of losing the US as the one global superpower. Now there are multiple countries exerting limited influence in their surroundings. However, even this is a simplification. In reality, there are three axes of the human experience where one or more countries or entities dominate. These separate and multipolar worlds are likely to carve out a new reality and could have significant ramifications for the global population moving forward. First, the security order is still being largely dominated by the US. While other countries have ramped up their military efforts, the US is still the one country that can deploy its soldiers virtually anywhere, at any time, and exert military pressure and influence globally, while other countries are mainly trying to shore up their immediate military influence. Consider the next three biggest contenders on the list: China, India, and Russia. China has been making significant advancements in its military technology and has unveiled multiple projects to counter US air and naval power. However, the country's actual technology levels are still lagging severely behind the competition. Take the newest stealth fighter, the Chengdu J-20 or Mighty Dragon. Although the aircraft is purported to be China's answer to the fifth-generation fighters such as the American F-22 and F-35 or Russian Su-57, its actual capability is similar to fourth or earlier generations. The J-20s were introduced at a time when NATO was actively getting rid of its fourth-generation aircraft by donating them to Ukraine and replacing them with American fifth-gens, which is consequently developing sixth-generation aircraft as we speak. Additionally, the US Marine Corps redesign planned to take effect in 2030 aims to directly refurbish that section of the US military force into semi-independent littoral combat units that can exert significant air and naval control over the islands in the South and East China Seas. This would mean that China can only realistically aim to control its immediate vicinity militarily. Furthermore, Beijing is already bordered by the other two most powerful militaries in the world, with India sure to pose a significant threat of its own. India has made great strides militarily due to its participation in the Quad, the strategic military dialogue that India participates in alongside the US, Japan, and Australia. The country has also passed China in total population and has experienced rapid technological and geopolitical growth in recent years. As China moves to isolate itself against foreign influence, India has come to embrace it and will pose a serious security threat for China moving forward, especially as the two countries already have a bitter history over claims in the Himalayas. Finally, Russia's previous military might has largely been dismantled by its paltry efforts in the Ukrainian invasion. With 315,000 troops either killed or injured, Russia has lost a majority of its pre-invasion military capacity and is now being forced to rebuild. The country's economy is almost fully committed to the short-term goal of funding the war effort, as gas and oil exports to China are only a fraction of their full potential. As a result, the country is basically sitting at the mercy of China to maintain its finances and faces the significant threat of collapsing politically if or when its military does. For now, the United States will keep being the largest military force on the planet. However, the country can no longer use this as leverage for economic or socio-political alignment, which is where the second axis, the economy, comes in. Economically, the US and China are by far the biggest world economies, but neither has the capability to distance itself from the other. Despite waning political alliances, the two economies have only grown more intertwined over the years, hitting a record high in bilateral trade in 2022. The global market wants to utilize both American security and the rising Chinese economy, which has allowed for smaller markets to create zones that both countries have to fight over. For example, the European Union is by far the largest common market in the world, setting standards that global companies, whether from the US, China, or elsewhere, have to abide by to do business in Europe and reach lucrative EU trade deals. However, India, Japan, and the Middle East are all significant players in the economic field. Take, for example, the proposed EU Middle East-India Economic Corridor that was announced at the 2023 G20 summit. Plans were proposed to create deeper economic ties between the three markets and bypass the bottleneck presented by the Suez Canal. Simultaneously, the corridor is a direct threat to China's planned Belt and Road Initiative that targets these same markets. Consequently, the Middle East stands to gain the most from these plans, considering the two proposals not as opposites but as complementary economic incentives for the regions that could bring it up to par with other markets. The disparity between US security and economic influences in the world has been a sore point for the US in recent years, leading to flagging economic areas as potential security concerns. One of the first such decisions was the sweeping set of semiconductor export controls, which aimed to prevent US companies from using foreign manufacturing platforms. The move was ultimately designed to limit China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea from accessing US-born chips and technology. But most chip magnates have significant holdings in China and rely on the country's beneficial manufacturing climate. This means that the top chip companies will be forced between the US economic and political benefits or the Chinese manufacturing ones. Many industry leaders are now warning that this move could have negative ripple effects. Since China is still one of the largest chip markets, the reduced income from the export ban could impede US research funding and ultimately allow China to catch up in chip-making technology, even if that point is decades away. Another US government move that saw widespread media attention is the looming potential ban on TikTok for the American audience. The social media platform is operated by a Chinese-owned company, and the US government wants to limit the influx of data from American users into China. While TikTok has roughly a year to comply with the law, which will almost undoubtedly be challenged in court and potentially delayed even longer, the country's economy stands to lose significantly if the platform were to get banned. According to TikTok's own statistics, it's used by an estimated 7 million US businesses and over 150 million Americans. Considering the severance of organic traffic to those companies, the US ban could cost the economy roughly $7 billion for companies alone. The ban could also stifle the growing influencer industry, creating a paradigm shift in American marketing. Other countries have lukewarm commitments to following the same standards as the US. While the EU aligns itself with some American proposals, its lack of unified military means that it stands more to gain by disentangling security and economic issues. As such, the economic world order would likely have multiple countries or economic entities, such as the EU, vying for more control as they try to ensure that the securities of the world's greatest powers can't dictate other countries' economic policies. So if a single country won't emerge as the world's next superpower due to economic or military power, then what will give them the edge? Between the push and pull of these two world orders, a new one is emerging. It's the digital world order, and it's guided not by countries or governments, but by corporations. And it could mean the effective end of borders or a complete reinforcement of them. The biggest technology companies have already been a turning point in the major conflicts of the 21st century. Consider their impact on the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO has been largely responsible for training the Ukrainian military and providing it with key equipment to physically defend its territory. However, without access to cybersecurity measures and modern communications devices provided by tech companies, Russian cyber attacks on Ukrainian communications channels could leave Ukraine wide open and in the dark about Russian army movements. Some companies have suspended their operations and exports to Russia, preventing Moscow from being able to utilize vital resources and funding that the companies provide via taxes and expenditure. For example, Apple suspended map support and its payment platform in Russia and removed vital Russian news outlets from its App Store outside of Russian territory. Google have also disabled live views of Ukrainian soil, hampering Russia's ability to access key targets. Even Chinese companies were largely ambivalent about the conflict or ended up siding with Ukraine. Without the tech company support, Ukraine might not have been able to turn what was meant to be a blitzkrieg into a prolonged war of attrition. And if Russia won the war single-handedly, the entire geopolitical situation between NATO, Russia, and China would have been turned on its head. Russia could exert significant military and economic influence on Western Europe, keeping its economy focused on industrial and technological growth rather than military upkeep. And China might not have been able to leverage cheap Russian oil and gas, remaining dependent on US-monitored naval trade routes between the Suez and Strait of Malacca. But the reach of global tech companies goes beyond military efforts. Modern communication options are what allowed Donald Trump to mount a successful presidential campaign and speak in real time to millions of Americans about dropping out of NATO and imposing more isolationist policies. They allow people to come together and plan for government-toppling protests such as the January 2023 incursion on Capitol Hill, the trucker protests in Canada, the revolt in Brazil, or the anti-government protests in the formerly Soviet Kazakhstan. The tech companies effectively have the power to corral masses into unified action, directing the flow of information, or in many cases disinformation, for their own goals. Tech companies now arguably have more control over major decisions in a country than its actual citizens, and can also directly control how users interact with the rest of the world through them. For example, major political campaigns can leverage enormous data pools that big tech companies have to target specific groups with precisely controlled political messaging and propaganda. Then those platforms can seamlessly curate the content shown to the user to create an echo chamber or a microenvironment that can reinforce existing beliefs or sway them towards the desired rhetoric. If successful, tech companies can effectively control how people vote and who they vote for. During the 2016 US presidential elections, the political consulting firm Cambridge Analytica acquired personal data from millions of Facebook users without consent. Worryingly, it was used to target American voters with political advertising, raising concerns about privacy and the ethical use of data in elections. This isn't only a national issue, as international companies often perform targeted propaganda attacks for foreign presidential campaigns. Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin admitted that Russia had been interfering with the US elections and would continue to do so. The main method of attack is through troll farms, groups of accounts specifically made to perpetuate a Russian-favored prerogative and disseminate it to US citizens. The tech companies that own the communication platforms used in these attacks often have little control or incentive to stop them until the problem is so widespread it impacts revenue or reputation. Considering the sheer scale of the attacks, it's highly likely that the problem just circulates between the most popular and effective platforms once they can figure out how to skirt their protective measures. Furthermore, tech companies are actively becoming some of the biggest players in the global economy, with market valuations in trillions, on par and in many cases larger than some countries. At the same time, the current political landscape in the US allows large corporations to avoid paying most of their federal income taxes. This means that the US government is losing tens of billions of dollars in tax income, putting significant strains on other sources of income, such as personal income taxation or smaller businesses, to make up for that loss. In fact, instead of paying corporate taxes, many corporations actively get tax breaks or government funding programs, creating an actual expense for the government. Additionally, corporations typically have much greater control over the American administrative and legal system. Corporate lobbying can actively redirect and impede the US government's efforts to control corporations within its borders. While a significant change would require a massive, one-sided effort from the American government, the current multifaceted lobbying system, with an incredibly competitive environment, makes enacting these changes difficult. Until the entire corporate system is overhauled, the US government will continue to increasingly favor the interests of large corporations such as tech companies over the needs of its citizens. These corporations likely have the resources necessary to hire adequate personnel who can navigate through the American legal system. In addition, they also regularly invest in academic research and think tanks that shape the intellectual environment in their industry to suit their interests. This means that tech companies effectively can take control over the country from the ground up. Beyond political control, tech companies have the power to shape people's minds and identities. The average American spends more than 1 hour a day on TikTok. The social media platform uses an algorithm to present content to the viewer. While the algorithm is supposedly using the user's history, there's no way for anyone to know how the content is actually placed into the user's feed without direct insight into the process. That means that the algorithm developed by a tech company can direct what part of the world's politics, ideology, or trends any given person is subjected to. The upcoming generation isn't being brought up entirely by their parents, peers, and the immediate environment. Some studies suggest that children as young as 3 are being regularly exposed to social media, allowing tech companies significant influence on rearing the newest voters from a young age. Once exposed to this form of media made addictive by algorithms and trends, people brought up with constant access to technology will push to integrate it even more into their futures. This allows tech companies to remain perpetually in control over human lives. Overall, tech companies can make meaningful, civilization-changing decisions due to their ability to influence both local and international economics and geopolitics. This will likely lead to one of three possible scenarios. If the US and Chinese governments manage to wrest control over their corporations and the tech companies align their policies with their home governments, the world could see a scenario similar to the Cold War transfer to the digital sphere. Each country in the world will have to pick one of the select few major platforms and be completely inundated with its ideology while remaining relatively ignorant or wary of others. The digital fragmentation will be followed by economic and political shifts, reversing globalization and creating relatively independent areas of influence dominated by the US, China, or whichever country holds the headquarters for the next biggest tech company. Tech companies may forego this alignment and push for independent competition between the digital and physical spheres. They will look at global growth strategies in their own industry. In turn, the economic and security world orders will be joined by a globalized digital world order dominated by them. This would create competition between the country governments and the biggest corporations. Since geopolitics and profits typically go hand in hand, corporations likely would never be able to completely ignore governmental policies or international events. Furthermore, since corporations in the Western world have far more influence than in China, the digital world order would likely heavily impede upon the others. And this leads to the last possible scenario, in which the potential next global superpower emerges as tech companies actively overwhelm the local governments and control global economics. It would lead to the digital sphere completely dominating the physical one, resulting in a new type of superpower, a potential global multipolar technocracy, where the tech companies effectively emulate physical governments. But should this come to pass, what would change? Interestingly, the actual effect it would have on the global economy is unlikely to be much different from the current situation, as it would change relatively little in the number of players and the key driving factors behind major policies. What real difference would it mean for the majority of the global population if power was split between the US and Chinese governments, or US and Chinese-based global corporations? Only time will tell. But what do you think? Can countries retain their status as superpowers independent of the major tech companies? What's the next world order going to look like? Leave a comment below to let us know what you think, and thanks for watching the video. By the end of 2012, American cybersecurity experts understood that there was a rat in their midst. To find it and its home base, Kyle Wilhoit, another expert in the field, attempted something of a social experiment. He built a water plant using advanced industrial techniques in the town of Arnold, Missouri. Actually, he didn't. There was nothing there except virtual signals sending fake data back and forth. Once the plant was connected to the internet, malicious actors attacked it from all sides, including some located in North Korea and Russia. However, the most sophisticated attack came from exactly the source Wilhoit expected. His server was bombarded with a series of knowledgeable emails with legitimate-looking attachments. However, these were phishing emails with malware embedded in these innocuous documents. Wilhoit downloaded the malware. Again, as he expected, his data was being stolen. He was soon on the chase, tracking where the information was being trafficked. Fortunately for him, the attacker made no effort to hide its point of origin. It was a server in Shanghai, China. Wilhoit not only tracked the location, but was able to infiltrate the server too, and it was full of government and corporate secrets, revealing the largest and most successful cybernetic espionage campaign in history. Wilhoit had confirmed all of the suspicions that had been going on for years. He had uncovered Operation Shady Rat. In this video, we'll take a look at China's Operation Shady Rat and its military espionage in general. We will also see how, despite the undoubted success of its campaign to steal American military secrets, it's failed to copy them with complete efficiency. But what secrets did China manage to steal from the US, and how was it ultimately stopped in completing this mission? Stick around to find out. A scandal in the Chinese military may have exposed some of its problems in late 2023 and early 2024, but there is still no doubt that it's much more capable than it was when Xi Jinping took power in November 2012. Building a world-class military that can contest America's traditional superiority in the Indo-Pacific region is one of his highest priorities. Xi will stop at nothing to ensure that he achieves that goal by the year 2049, including outright robbery. The then outgoing United States Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, described China's approach to intellectual property theft as rob, replicate, and replace. China robs US companies of their intellectual property, replicates the technology, and then replaces the US firms in the global marketplace. China has attempted the same approach to military technology. The two are part of the same campaign through Beijing's strategy of military-civil fusion. According to the US State Department, the strategy aims to bring down barriers between commercial and military technological applications. The robbery of civilian technology, particularly in the emerging field of artificial intelligence, is something China wishes to apply to improving the People's Liberation Army as much as it wants to use it to replace Western firms at the center of global commerce. Espionage is therefore an all-encompassing strategy for the Chinese in their ambitions to emerge as the world's leading technological and military powerhouse. State sponsorship of hackers is one of the most important tools of espionage in China's arsenal. This is the origin of the hacker group alternatively known as APT-1, Comment Crew, Comment Panda, GIF89A, Byzantine Candor, and several other Chinese language names. The attacks by this group are known collectively as China's Operation Shady Rat. APT-1's known activity began in 2006 and first targeted a South Korean construction company. Targets since then have ranged from commercial enterprises, government agencies, non-profit groups, the United Nations, and even the International Olympic Committee. These seemingly separate attacks were first identified as an organized phenomenon by Dmitry Alperovich, the VP of Threat Research at McAfee, in August 2011. By then, he had confirmed over 70 targets, 49 of which were in the United States. The method was the same, a series of spear-phishing emails sent to those with a good level of access in the target entity. These emails closely emulated colleagues or other people who were knowledgeable about the entity being targeted. The only giveaway that something might not be right was that the emails sometimes seemed to be written by someone who had less than perfect command of the English language. These emails would contain an attachment that housed malware, according to Alperovich. That malware will execute and initiate a backdoor communication channel to the command and control web server and interpret the instructions encoded in the hidden comments embedded in the web page code. This will quickly be followed by live intruders jumping onto the infected machine and proceeding to quickly escalate privileges and move laterally within the organization to establish new persistent footholds via additional compromised machines running implant malware, as well as targeting for quick exfiltration the key data they came for. Crucially, Alperovich identified 13 defense contractors that had been targeted by 2011. In 2013, cybersecurity professionals working with Mandiant, a subsidiary of Google, gave the group its name and discovered what it really was. A more recent report in December 2021 followed up on this conclusion. APT-1 was actually Unit 61398 in the People's Liberation Army. It and APT-1 are identical in location near Shanghai, mission and capabilities. This unit is known to carry out information and electronic warfare, ranging from cybernetic efforts to more mundane tasks like posting propaganda on social media. As early as 2009, it became known that stealing military secrets was one of APT-1's highest priorities. A young Chinese hacker first got on the unit's trail through discovering that his client, an American defense contractor, had found malicious programs on its computer network. APT-1's attempts to steal military technology go from large pieces of hardware that we will look into in a moment to far less spectacular components. For example, known targets have included 29 chemical companies and 19 other firms that make materials for military use. The theft of this information gave China data on how to construct the finished products it was attempting to steal. The similarity of many of China's new weapons to American designs leaves no doubt that the work of APT-1 and other Chinese hackers has found its way into the PLA. Examples abound. One of the most obvious is the CASC Rainbow drone. This UAV is almost an exact replica of the American MQ-9 Reaper. The Rainbow can carry 6 weapons, a payload between 250 and 340 kilograms, and has a ceiling of about 5 kilometers. Likewise, the Reaper can carry 6 weapons, has a 380 kilogram payload capacity, and comes with a ceiling of about 15 kilometers. China's HJ-12 Red Arrow portable anti-tank weapon is another blatant example, as it's almost an exact knockoff of the American FGM-148 Javelin design. The Red Arrow has an effective range from 75 to 2,000 meters, extendable to 4,000 meters with TV guidance, can penetrate 800 millimeters of armor, and launches a tandem heat-guided warhead by infrared or TV imaging. The Javelin has the exact same attributes. Then there's China's Harbin Z-20 helicopter, which looks almost exactly the same as the American UH-60 Black Hawk. It has a length of 20 meters, a 16-meter main rotor diameter, and a 5.3-meter height. It can carry up to 10 tons and may be armed with machine guns, rocket pods, and various missiles. Likewise, the Black Hawk can be armed with similar weapons. It's slightly smaller but has otherwise similar dimensions and can carry a little more weight at 11 tons, but there's no doubt that the Chinese design was inspired by the American one. China has not been as successful in creating exact replicas of other weapons stolen from the United States, though. However, the stolen American weapon designs have nevertheless been critical in strengthening China's military. In a move that left little doubt about Beijing's intentions, Lockheed Martin was one of the first targets for Operation Shady Rat. Lockheed Martin is the manufacturer of both of America's fifth-generation fighter aircraft, the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II. As early as 2007, APT-1 compromised Lockheed Martin's network in a major way. Not coincidentally, China's first fifth-generation fighter, the Chengdu J-20, had its maiden flight only 4 years later. Another fifth-generation fighter in development, the J-31, had its first flight in 2012. At first, the US military denied that it and its contractors had suffered a major data theft, but documents later leaked by Edward Snowden confirmed that the Chinese hackers had indeed stolen sensitive information on the F-35. The documents revealed that Chinese efforts particularly focused on getting the plane's radar design and engine schematics, among other secret materials. Terabytes worth of data on the Lightning II were taken. The hackers with APT-1 also succeeded in stealing information on the F-22, the B-2 Spirit bomber, space lasers, missile navigation and tracking systems, anti-air missile designs, and material on nuclear submarines. These were only the more notable examples of over 30,000 hacking incidents, which included 500 significant intrusions into the US Department of Defense, over 1,600 DoD computers compromised, and 600,000 user accounts infiltrated. 50 terabytes of data were stolen, equivalent to 5 times the total information content in the Library of Congress. The damages were estimated to be at least $100 million. The Chinese government has denied any involvement in these incidents. At the time of its maiden flight, aviation experts noted certain similarities between the Chengdu J-20 and the F-22. While the Chinese plane is bigger and heavier, suggesting an emphasis on long range and heavy weapon loads, these authorities noted that the stealth body shaping of the J-20 was like that of the F-22. Both planes had flat body sides aligned with the canted tails, clean wing junction bodies, and sharp chine lines around their forward fuselages. Notably, they noted that the cant angles were greater than that seen on the F-35, and the J-20's frameless canopy was similar to that of the F-22. The weapons bays were also noted to be like the F-22, with the J-20's landing gear retracting into body side bays. However, even back then, these aviation experts saw that the J-20 might have been a less than perfect replica of the F-22 if stealth was what its engineers had in mind. Notably, the aircraft's rear features like underwing actuator fairings, axis-symmetric engine exhausts, and the plane's ventral fins were suboptimal for stealth designs. Writing for Aviation Week in January 2011, Bill Sweetman came to a predictive conclusion. There are 2 possible explanations for this. Either the aircraft seen here is the first step toward an operational design, or China's requirements do not place as much stress on rear aspect signatures. The latter has proven to be the case, whether through China's intention or not. While the J-20 is a major step forward for Chinese aviation, most of the plane's stealth features are indeed concentrated on the front. The sides and rear of the plane are comparatively lacking, meaning that if it needs to turn, the J-20 is much more detectable by radar. The J-20 also has a few features of the F-35. It has an active electronically scanned array (AESA) radar, potentially boasting some stolen technology from the F-35's AN/APG-81, which makes some experts believe that it has the potential to act as an airborne early warning command and control (AWACS) aircraft. It mounts electro-optical and infrared sensors on its frame to provide 360-degree situational awareness to the pilot, which can be shared with other friendly assets. Despite the stolen technology, though, the J-20's radar is still likely an early AESA radar, originating from the JXX program in the early 1990s, one which cannot quite match the flying supercomputer capability of the F-35. Some Chinese security experts have also quietly admitted that even the new engine for the J-20, the domestically designed and manufactured WS-15, is at least a decade behind the F-35's Pratt & Whitney F-135. China's infiltration of other American defense contractors is also made clear by the advent of the stealth strategic bomber it has in the works, the Zhan H-20. Although this bomber has never been put on a public display and has missed its maiden flight scheduled for 2022, available evidence from a PLAAF recruiting ad that came out in 2021 suggests that its design is similar to the B-2. Like the Spirit, the bomber's design seems to be based around using stealth rather than speed to penetrate an enemy's air defense zone. It's flying a wing design with a blended wing body, embedded engines, and a lack of vertical features, all of which makes it less detectable to radar. As for its own radar, the H-20 will likely boast an improved Chinese AESA system to better observe lower detectable threats and identify targets at longer ranges. The internal and external design of the revealed H-21 seem to confirm that China has infiltrated the B-2's manufacturer, Northrop Grumman, and stolen data on the Spirit, as the Snowden documents suggest. American intelligence officials believe that China's stealth bomber program began in the early 2000s, with Chinese aviation experts studying the feasibility of both flying wing and supersonic delta wing versions. The early 2000s seems to have been a time before the advent of APT-1 and Operation Shady Rat, but another date provides a clue about the influence of the PLA hackers on the effort to create the H-20. The project team at the Xi'an Aircraft Industrial Corporation's 603 Aircraft Design Institute seems to have settled on a subsonic flying wing aircraft frame with 4 engines in 2011, years after the launch of Operation Shady Rat. It is possible that the PLAAF and XAC originally began with the idea of a supersonic delta wing bomber, but after receiving APT-1's data, went with the B-2 knockoff idea instead. The dimensions for the two planes seem similar. The H-20 even likely uses 4 engines, just like the B-2. Around the same time as this change, the USAF began laying plans for the coming replacement for the B-2, the B-21 Raider. It's unknown if any of the details on the new bomber were stolen by China's state-sponsored hackers, but Operation Shady Rat was designed not only to retrieve existing data, but to keep malware on infected computer systems to steal future data. It's possible that APT-1 had malware buried deep within Northrop Grumman's network and lifted data on the B-21 as it was conceived in the early 2010s. However, despite China's clearly successful theft of information related to at least one of America's stealth bombers, the H-20 is likely not a perfect knockoff of the B-2, although we cannot be certain until the plane is actually revealed to the public. The H-20 has a few features that seem to make it more detectable to radar than its American inspiration. Available evidence suggests that the H-20 might be able to adjust its wing angle. However, the seam required to do this makes the plane more detectable. If the wings are angled at any point, the plane will be much less stealthy than if it had a smooth design like the B-2. This reality leaves one wondering why Chinese engineers decided to build such a feature if stealth was the intention. With both the J-20 and H-20, China has shown that it may have been able to lift data on stealth aircraft, but it has a less than perfect understanding of why America designed those planes the way it did. Data can be stolen, but institutional experience is a lot harder to replicate. China also has been keenly interested in stealing naval secrets. Building a strong navy enough to challenge America's maritime dominance is vital for it if it wants to break the containment of the first island chain, which is the chain of islands encompassing Japan, Taiwan, portions of the Philippines, and Indonesia, and become a military superpower. Countering them and getting equally advanced submarines is therefore a high priority for Beijing. China has only a few nuclear submarines, and even the ones it does have are noisy. The existing submarines are noisier than Soviet-era nuclear submarines from the 1970s, which make it almost impossible for them to bypass the first island chain's choke points without being detected. The PLAN has 2 new submarine types in development to make up for this shortcoming. These are the Type 095 nuclear attack and the Type 096 nuclear ballistic missile submarines, respectively. Both of these submarines should be significantly quieter thanks to the presence of a single hull, a shaftless drive, and electronic noise-cancelling technology. The new submarines will also be larger than their predecessors, which will help keep the noise lower because the diameter of the previous ones was too small to provide enough space to insulate the steel exterior from the interior vibrations of the vessel's machinery. The exteriors will also have anechoic coating to make them less detectable. China has also used Russian technology to make its submarines quieter, as seen in the latter's Akula-class submarines. The influence in stolen American designs might be particularly seen in the coming JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile, which is expected to have a range of about 9,000 to 10,000 kilometers. Each of these missiles might carry multiple warheads delivered through multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. This feature might have been inspired by the US Navy's Trident II, which can carry up to 14 warheads with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs. However, the Center for Strategic and International Studies still believes the JL-3 will be less payload heavy, with up to about 3 warheads per missile. It's also notable that the Trident II still likely has a longer range than the JL-3 at 12,000 kilometers. Despite some remaining shortcomings, experts expect that China's new submarines will be operational by 2030 and pose a much more formidable threat than the current submarine force. This is partly why the United States and United Kingdom decided to share nuclear submarine technology with Australia in the AUKUS Agreement of 2021. China's military still has rough edges. The recent scandal revealed that corruption remains a persistent problem. Nevertheless, it's no longer the military backwater it was 30 years ago, at the time of the third Taiwan Strait crisis. Beijing has built a military machine much more capable of offensive power projection, and one whose weaponry and technology is still improving. Gone are the days when China fielded outdated second-generation fighter jets and had limited naval capability. The improvements in China's military technology have at least as much to do with its state-sponsored espionage campaign as it does with its domestic defense industry. China is much more careful about its cybernetic efforts today, and the cybersecurity of America's governments and defense contractors are much more sophisticated. The brazenness of Operation Shady Rat is now a thing of the past. However, its impact will be felt for many years to come. China's rise as a military power is in large part thanks to the extensive set of secrets that APT-1 was able to lift from America's premier defense contractors through the use of innocent-looking phishing emails. Although its ability to completely replicate and replace American military technology seems less clear, China's hackers have demonstrated their ability to rob, and sometimes that's all you need to make yourself powerful enough to undermine the international status quo and the efforts of the ruling power to maintain it. PLA Unit 61398 is still active. What do you think of China's Operation Shady Rat? What other military secrets might it have stolen? And how will Unit 61398 operate in the future? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Now go check out the real reason why China's world domination plan failed, or click this other video instead.
Under the cover of darkness, a lone sniper arrives at the concealed perch. He unpacks his rifle with practiced efficiency, assembling it piece by piece in an almost ritualistic fashion. Settling into the shadows, his piercing gaze narrows to a singular focus, the unsuspecting target. With time seemingly suspended, the sniper pulls the trigger with unwavering concentration, making a headshot with chilling accuracy. The target crumbles to the ground. Just as swiftly as the shot was taken, the sniper disassembles the rifle and retreats into the night, with the area remaining oblivious to the silent dance of death that unfolded in its midst. Sounds cinematic, doesn't it? That's because it is. Scenes like this only exist in the realm of fiction, often crafted by the imaginative hands of Hollywood directors. But the truth is that this relatively short scene is riddled with factual errors. In real life, snipers are rarely alone. They can easily spend 24 to 72 hours stalking their target. They aren't ready to shoot immediately, and as the title of the video suggests, they rarely take the headshot. Now, the other 3 inaccuracies probably make more sense. In contrast, avoiding a headshot often surprises people. After all, isn't a sniper's job to neutralize the target with a single, precise shot? And what better part of the target for this goal than the head? Well, in reality, there are better parts of the body to target. And neutralizing the target often isn't even the sniper's primary task. Since snipers are obviously misunderstood in more ways than one, let's dispel these myths and shed light on the realities of sniper operations. To do this, we must break down everything that goes into what the US Department of Defense calls the art of the shot. Let's start with the sniper's mindset. What do snipers think about before pulling the trigger? There isn't a single answer to this question. Instead, there are dozens of possible considerations going into a single shot, and the sniper usually makes a sort of mental checklist encompassing all of them. But what are these considerations? Number 1 is undoubtedly ballistics, the bullet. Snipers must account for anything that might affect the bullet's flight path and cause them to miss. This extensive knowledge of ballistics is actually what separates snipers, who make up less than 0.5% of the United States Army, from the rest of the troops who simply have a good aim. When discussing bullet ballistics, it's crucial to pay attention to both internal and external factors. Internal ballistics refers to everything happening to the bullet while it's inside the rifle. A US Army sniper instructor puts it, the bullet is not going to lie to you. For instance, internal factors include the barrel twist, which affects the bullet's stability at greater distances. However, internal ballistics also includes the bullet's size and weight, as these factors can determine how much the bullet will be impacted by external factors. Speaking of these factors, they are part of external ballistics. External ballistics cover everything that affects the bullet's path after exiting the barrel. These factors include wind, humidity, temperature, air density, barometric pressure. Out of all of these factors, wind is arguably the most influential. Why? Because it can change speed and direction suddenly and inexplicably. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that the wind accounts for most missed shots in the US Army. That's why snipers pay special attention to this factor. During wind readings, they rely on the on-the-fly wind indicators like trash, flagging vegetation, clothes on a clothesline, smoke drift, dust, or virtually any lightweight object that responds to wind movement. Snipers gauge how these elements interact with the wind to determine its speed and direction at various points along the bullet's flight path. Now, the next sniper consideration might surprise you. When preparing for a shot, snipers must account for the curvature and rotation of the Earth. That's right, these factors play a role, especially in long-range shots. This has to do with the Coriolis effect. The Coriolis effect is the apparent deflection of moving objects, such as air or water currents, caused by the Earth's rotation. This deflection occurs to the right in the northern hemisphere and the left in the southern hemisphere, influencing global wind patterns, ocean currents, and evidently, bullet trajectories. A deflection of even a few inches can cause snipers to miss. That's why they must keep the Coriolis effect in mind. If they're shooting west, the bullet will drift slightly to the south, hitting lower than expected. When shooting east, it's the opposite. The target will drop down ever so slightly, causing the bullet to hit higher than expected. Other considerations snipers should keep in mind before pulling the trigger include the shot's angle, the target's elevation, and anything else that could throw off the shot, such as thicker vegetation, sun glare, and obstacles in the bullet's path. Since the sniper's first shot is likely their best chance at striking the target, they will only fire when most of these factors align for optimal accuracy. When this happens, they usually only say 2 words: shooter ready. So we've covered what calculations the sniper must make before pulling the trigger. Next, how do snipers remain hidden when stalking their targets? The answer is, again, 2 words, this time ghillie suits. A ghillie suit is arguably the sniper's most significant asset on the ground, as it allows them to stay concealed in various terrains by mimicking surrounding vegetation. This means a ghillie suit consists of branches, leaves, moss, and any other local vegetation that will help them match their surroundings. For instance, a sniper will likely use dead grass when stationed in an arid environment. But blending in isn't the only goal of a ghillie suit. This suit must also break up the curves of the human body that might otherwise catch the eye. These curves include the side of the neck connecting to the shoulders, armpits, the groin. Breaking up these curves is no easy task. That's why an entire day at the elite US Army Sniper Course, USASC, is dedicated to learning to make a ghillie suit. Snipers-to-be are instructed to use a durable fabric for the suit's foundation, most commonly burlap, reinforce the high wear and tear areas by sewing or gluing them down, and meticulously attach the vegetation. Soldiers are also taught how to camouflage the body parts the suit doesn't cover, like the face, neck, and hands. With the full camouflage ensemble on, students go through the event known as the ghillie wash. This event has 2 goals: to test the suit's durability and to ingrain natural colors into the suit's fabric. With the ghillie suit out of the way, there's only one essential piece of equipment left: the sniper rifle. Now, singling out just one sniper rifle is a complex task. After all, the US heavily invests in its military, spending about $877 billion in 2022, which was 3.5% of its gross domestic product, GDP. That's why it shouldn't be surprising that the US Army uses over 50 different sniper rifles. This staggering figure can also be explained by the many scenarios snipers might face. The type of rifle used will likely depend on whether the sniper is in a crowded city or nature, a searing desert, or a snow-covered mountain. The mission might include simply patrolling or engaging in Overwatch for the assault team. Or the sniper might deal with a hostage situation or a counter-sniper operation. Whatever the case, there's no use in trying to list all the rifles a US sniper might use. Instead, we'll focus on one beloved by many snipers, the M2010 Enhanced Sniper Rifle. We'll use this model to explain how snipers assemble their weapons leading up to the shot, Immediately after this explanation, you'll find out why the shot in question is rarely a headshot. But for now, let's go back to the M2010. This bolt-action, magazine-fed weapon system is chambered for the .300 Winchester Magnum ammunition and has a 5-round capacity. With the suppressor, this rifle is roughly 52.2 inches long while weighing 18.7 pounds when loaded. As for the effective firing range, the M2010 can engage targets at distances of up to 1,312 yards. The M2010 was first built for the Special Forces fighting in the war in Afghanistan in early 2011. Since then, it's become a favorite due to its ability to fold down to a more compact size for transport, as well as be tailored to accommodate a wide range of shooter preferences. In total, 2,558 M2010 rifles have been manufactured. Interestingly, the total number of US Army snipers is also around that number, roughly 2,000. Sounds like a match made in heaven. But to make this match possible, let's see a brief overview of the most important steps in the M2010 assembly. Step 1. The sniper attaches the barrel to the receiver and secures it tightly. The M2010 uses a 24-inch hammer-forged carbon steel barrel that contains a twist, spiral grooves designed to give the bullet a spinning motion, thus improving its accuracy. Step 2. The sniper inserts a rotating bolt, ensuring it functions properly. Step 3. The sniper affixes the optic system, in this case a Leupold Mark IV 6.5 to 20 by 50 mm tactical rifle scope with a scalable range. This scope has several purposes and benefits. It enhances precision in limited visibility, provides a waterproof picture, and reduces light diffusion. Step 4. The sniper mounts the bipod to stabilize the rifle. Though bipods are primarily used in the prone position, snipers also rely on them for additional support when alternating shooting positions. Step 5. The sniper mounts the suppressor. This non-lethal firearm accessory will lower the shot's sound to around 130 decibels at most, which is roughly as loud as a chainsaw. The suppressor will also eliminate the muzzle flash. Step 6. The sniper verifies the functionality of all components through a thorough inspection. If all is well, there's nothing left to do but to take the shot. But which body part will this shot target? We've established that it isn't the head, but why? Snipers don't usually go for the headshot because heads are actually quite challenging targets. They are relatively small and they move around almost constantly. This makes them almost impossible to hit, especially from longer distances. So where will the sniper target? When shooting from significant distances, like over 300 yards, snipers will aim for a bigger surface, increasing their chances of a successful hit. The surface in question is the center mass, or the upper portion of the chest. Think of this surface as a triangle stretching from the chest to the neck. Alternatively, snipers can aim for another triangle, the one from the hip bones to the pelvis. These two areas contain the neck, the heart, the lungs, and the gastrointestinal tract, all potentially fatal targets if hit. However, this choice will depend on the sniper's distance and mission circumstances. Since snipers typically only get one chance to put the target down, they'll have to decide where to aim on the fly to ensure a higher kill probability. In some situations, snipers can also aim to wound and not kill. Why? Because the wounded target will typically be hauled to safety by at least two teammates, taking a more significant number of enemies out of action. The only situation where snipers might be forced to go for a headshot is when the target is wearing sturdy body armor. Police snipers can also shoot at the head, especially if the target is hiding behind a cover. Since these snipers shoot from much shorter distances, they can target the head more accurately. Now that we've dispelled arguably the biggest myth about snipers, let's tackle the rest. First up, stalking and eliminating a target is all snipers do. In reality, stalking a target is just one aspect of a sniper's duties. Sure, it's a crucial aspect, but snipers don't get to do it as much as you would think. More often than not, probably in 90% of operations, snipers are involved in extensive reconnaissance tasks, gathering critical intelligence for the successful execution of missions. Just think about it. If snipers can get within shooting distance from their target, they can also discreetly observe its movements. The gathered information is then sent to the command to be used for crucial mission decision-making, such as organizing airstrikes. If the command proceeds with an airstrike, the sniper will also be there to report whether the target was hit effectively. However, there's another crucial sniper's duty that may or may not involve shooting. The duty in question is providing overwatch for tactical operations. During a tactical operation, snipers are assigned areas of responsibility with one goal: watching over their teammates and ensuring their safety. If, for example, one of the enemy combatants on the ground finds a way to endanger the team, The sniper, positioned strategically, can swiftly and accurately neutralize the target. Just knowing that there are vigilant guardians watching over them allows team members on the ground to move more freely and do their jobs with confidence. Experienced soldiers often say they can't even count how many times a sniper saved their lives during an operation. That's what makes snipers arguably the most valuable asset in a tactical team. However, it's essential to know that snipers also work in teams. At a minimum, they work in a team of two, a shooter and a spotter. Though you'll rarely see the latter in Hollywood blockbusters, their role is actually more important than the shooters. Think of the spotter as a team leader who's in control every step of the way. Spotters decide all the gear they'll need for the mission, communicate with the command team, identify the actual target, and give firing commands to the shooter. Basically, the shooter is only there to pull the trigger. If the shooter happens to miss, the spotter will make a swift second shot correction and relay that info to the shooter, who will, hopefully, be more successful the second time round. It takes a lot of experience to become a spotter. These individuals have already served as shooters, mastering the art of the perfect shot, so now their job is to help others do the same. Let's tackle another misconception from the cinematic intro to the video. No, snipers aren't ready to shoot as soon as they get into position. First, they must go through the so-called direct fire engagement process. This process can be roughly broken into several steps. Step 1. Detecting potential threats or targets in the environment. Step 2. Identifying the target's identity. Step 3. Deciding whether to engage the target. Step 4. Engaging the target after considering relevant internal and external factors. Step 5. Assessing the immediate impact of the shot. Now, these steps might seem simple, 1, 2, 3 and we're done. But in reality, days can pass between some of them. Being a sniper requires a huge amount of patience. The same goes for discipline and attentiveness, as the sniper will need lots of those to stay focused throughout the mission with all the waiting they must deal with. During this time, snipers often operate without the help of their unit, so they must also learn how to manage their resources effectively. All these necessary skills beg the question, can anyone or anything replace snipers? This brings us to the next myth about snipers. Technology is slowly phasing their role out. According to an instructor at the US Army Sniper Course, this claim is absolutely false. Sure, things like drones, robots, and satellites can immensely aid snipers, enhancing their surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. However, the unique combination of skills, adaptability, and decision-making that a human sniper possesses makes them irreplaceable. And that's not to mention that technology can be rather unreliable in specific circumstances, such as adverse weather conditions or electronic interference. That's why snipers are taught never to rely on electronics entirely, even though there are tools that can help them determine crucial factors like range, wind speed, and environmental conditions. The tool used to calculate the range or distance is called a rangefinder. This device sends a laser pulse toward the target and measures how long it takes for the pulse to be reflected off the target and returned to the sniper. Military-grade rangefinders can operate at ranges of up to 25 miles and are often combined with monoculars or binoculars. Still, snipers will often use these and similar electronic devices only to verify the data, but ultimately they will rely on their training and skills to make critical decisions. Speaking of these skills, they do translate to the civilian world, despite another popular misconception. That's why civilian and government agencies often recruit snipers after they leave the military. Thanks to their unique set of attributes, they will excel in any role requiring keen observation, decision-making under pressure, and situational awareness. Okay, so we've covered most of the major myths regarding snipers. Now let's do a rapid-fire round to dispel some of the sillier ones. Number 1. Snipers don't take diazepam to reduce trembling. This medicine might be prevalent in sniping video games, but in reality, it could cause the sniper to feel sleepy, dizzy, and forgetful. Number 2. Snipers don't hold their breath when taking a shot. This would only starve their body of oxygen and make their aim less steady. Instead, snipers are trained to control their breathing, taking the shot during a natural respiratory pause. And number 3. Snipers don't close one eye when shooting. Despite what many movie scenes might suggest, shooting with one eye closed would only limit their peripheral vision and situational awareness. It would also cause unnecessary strain on the eye that remains open, affecting the sniper's focus and overall shooting performance. But let's say something does get in the way of a sniper's performance and they miss the shot. What happens then? It all depends on the specific circumstances and the target. If they act quickly enough, they might be able to adjust accordingly and take another shot. This is primarily made possible by the splash of the first shot or the exact location where the shot landed. Still, Missing a shot can greatly compromise the overall mission, especially if it reveals the sniper's position. With this in mind, let's discuss another commonly asked question. What happens to captured snipers? The short answer is nothing good. Captured snipers are usually treated much worse than other prisoners of war due to the specialized nature of their training and the threat they pose to the enemy. These enemies see snipers as treasure troves of intel, which is why they often subject them to harsh interrogation methods that might deviate from established rules of war. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that most snipers would rather die than be captured. However, the enemy troops certainly don't make avoiding capture easy. You see, they often heavily invest in sniper countermeasures aimed at capturing these highly skilled soldiers or eliminating them altogether. The most popular among these include using friendly snipers to engage the US snipers, employing unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones, to detect potential sniper positions and movements, using electronic jamming equipment to disrupt communication and targeting systems used by snipers, dispatching canine units to track and locate them, creating a smoke screen to disrupt the sniper's line of sight, rushing the sniper's position to flush them out and eliminate them, bombarding the area where snipers are suspected to hide. Given all these measures, it's safe to conclude that snipers are seen as the deadliest soldiers on the battlefield. The combination of marksmanship, stealth, and ability to gather critical intelligence makes them a formidable and high-priority threat. But how do snipers become such lethal soldiers? The answer lies in the US Army Sniper Course. We've already mentioned this prestigious course when discussing the ghillie suits. Still, these suits are just a small fraction of the extensive training provided to snipers-to-be. This course takes place at Fort Moore, Georgia, and lasts for 7 weeks. Only about 300 soldiers from the Army or National Guard will get the chance to complete this course yearly. At best, half of them will be successful, which speaks volumes about the rigorous nature of the course. Here's a brief overview of what the US Army Sniper Course entails. Week 1, soldiers are tested on their physical and marksmanship skills and taught to make the ghillie suit. Week 2, snipers-to-be go through stalking events, target detection, and reconnaissance exercises. Week 3, students learn the basics of sniper marksmanship and range estimation. Week 4, physical challenges become mental as limited visibility scenarios are introduced. Week 5, students start practicing with moving targets. Week 6, future snipers are taught to use new weapons and shoot them from less stable positions. Week 7, soldiers carry out full-fledged missions and get graded on their success. The graded stalking events are the reason most trainees don't make it through the US Army Sniper Course. During these events, they spend several hours moving at a snail's pace, trying to reach their target while avoiding detection by the course's instructors. The latter part is usually what goes wrong, as these instructors are experts in spotting even the slightest movements or disturbances in the environment. Of course, all of these exercises are meant to simulate real-world scenarios, preparing snipers for complexities they may face in actual combat situations. These complexities are also why snipers never stop training and learning, even after leaving Fort Moore. Battlefield tactics are constantly evolving, so snipers also refine and adapt their skills to stay ahead of potential threats and keep the title of the most feared soldier on the battlefield. And there you have it, all the most popular questions about snipers answered, including why they avoid headshots. Now it's time to hear from you. Have any of these facts surprised you? Sound off in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts. Can you shoot medics in war? If not, what happens if you do? In this video, our military experts delve into the origins and evolution of the legal protection afforded to combat medics. We also look at how the dangers and chaos of the battlefield ensure that these protections are often less than perfect in practice, as well as how these legal protections are increasingly under threat by 21st century technologies and the conduct of nations who have concluded that targeting medics is convenient to the accomplishment of military objectives. The origins of formal protections for medical personnel on the battlefield come with the First Geneva Convention, which began as an agreement exclusively among European states. This treaty was put into place in 1864. Article 6 of the document reads, "Evacuations of wounded soldiers, together with the persons under whose directions they take place, shall be protected by absolute neutrality." Article 7 of the First Geneva Convention set the precedent for how to identify a combat medic. A distinctive and uniform flag shall be adopted for hospitals, ambulances, and evacuations. It must, on every occasion, be accompanied by the national flag.
An arm badge, brassard, shall be allowed for individuals neutralized, but the delivery thereof shall be left to military authority. The flag and the arm badge shall bear a red cross on a white ground. Other non-European states which have since agreed to the First Geneva Convention have adopted other symbols, like the Red Crescent or Red Star of David, in place of the cross, but the basic framework remains intact. A red-on-white pattern is prominent and easy to identify. Combat medics after 1864 wore the identifier on their helmets in addition to the armbands. The First Geneva Convention, which is purposed for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded and sick in the armed forces in the field, saw revisions in 1906, 1929, and 1949, which expanded the protections afforded to combat medics. Additional protocols were added to the First Geneva Convention in 1977. Among the modern protections for combat medics include the prohibition of taking them as prisoners of war in most cases. This protection reads, members of such personnel will not be considered as prisoners of war if they fall in the hands of the adversary. They must be freed unless the number of prisoners of war and their state of health require the contrary, in which case the medical personnel must be given the facilities and rights necessary to ensure the respect for medical ethics. And furthermore, if prisoners of war have medical expertise, they may be required to exercise medical function in the interest of other prisoners. In such cases, they have the same rights as the rest of the medical personnel. Additionally, on the battlefield, medical personnel cannot ever be punished for carrying out their duties as long as they are in line with medical ethics, a protection which also extends to civilians who may be carrying out such medical duties. Occupying powers also have the duty to ensure the maintenance of all medical facilities and activities, and must allow medical practitioners within the territory they occupy to carry out their functions unimpeded. Protections for medics in the modern Geneva Convention are so broad that they are afforded almost complete freedom of movement as their duties require. Even soldiers who are not formally trained medics, but who are temporarily assigned to medical functions such as stretcher bearers, are afforded the full protection of regular combat medics by the terms of the First Geneva Convention. Further protections for medical personnel on the battlefield are specified in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. The 1899 Convention reinforces the immunities outlined in the Geneva Convention of 1864 with regard to the treatment of sick and wounded. The 10th Treaty of the 1907 Hague Convention adapts the 1864 Geneva Convention's provisions to maritime warfare. The Second Geneva Convention later superseded the 1907 Treaty, but with the same basic protections for medics intact. It's understandable why the protection of combat medics would be so highly prioritized. The US Army estimates that about 20% of combat-related deaths are preventable if wounded soldiers can receive medical attention in time. As many as 50% of wounded soldiers die in combat because of severe blood loss, with 86% of combat fatalities occurring within half an hour of injury. Prompt medical attention and evacuation can prevent these things from occurring. Aside from the humanitarian reasons, these statistics remind us that there can be an element of mutual cynicism involved in protecting medics. Wounded soldiers who are saved have a chance of returning to the front and remaining assets for their country during wartime. Dead soldiers have seen the end of their usefulness. Historically, combat medics usually did not carry weapons, a fact which was in line with their role of being officially recognized non-combatants. However, modern medics do carry weapons. They are given the same basic training as all other soldiers to navigate the hazards of the battlefield. This basic training includes weapons training. In a 2014 interview with Business Insider, a medic in the British Army, who did not wish to be identified, described and showed off the equipment he carried. His gear included a 5.56mm SA-80A2 rifle, a 9mm Sig Sauer P226 pistol, and plenty of grenades. Although medics are not sent to participate in combat missions, if they do fire on the enemy in any offensive way, they give up the legal protections that the First Geneva Convention assigns them. They carry the appropriate means to defend themselves and their patients. This is where a little history is in order. The modern practice for medics legally being allowed to carry weapons originates in World War II. Prior to then, there was no explicit statement on the matter, but the general practice was that medical practitioners should not carry weapons, lest they be blurred with regular combat soldiers. During the Second World War, medics did not often carry weapons, lest they lose the protections afforded to them by the Geneva and Hague Conventions. Some of them carried sidearms, however, and this proved the start of a trend that the war would reinforce. Despite its brutality elsewhere, Nazi Germany was a signatory to the First Geneva Convention, and generally respected enemy personnel who wore clear markers of a combat medic, at least on the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, things were different. Neither the Russian Empire nor its successor state, the Soviet Union, were parties to the First Geneva Convention at the time, and while the Russian Empire did sign the Hague Convention, it came with reservations. The Soviet Union was also never confirmed to be a party to the Hague Conventions. As a result of this and the Lebensraum living space policy, where the inhabitants of Eastern Europe were viewed as undesirables that needed to be dispossessed of their land for colonizing Germans, Nazi Germany did not differentiate Soviet medics from other soldiers, either as combatants or as prisoners of war. Naturally, the Soviet Union treated German medics the same way. The Japanese did not have much regard for medics either, despite being a party to the First Geneva Convention. Japanese soldiers often deliberately targeted medics to cause more havoc in their enemy's forces and demoralize the wounded men under their care. The practice was so widespread that Japanese soldiers tended to shout "medic" in English to specifically draw them into their sights. Unfortunately for the medics, their prominent insignia made them very easy for Japanese soldiers to target. The protection these symbols were supposed to afford had instead become the most dangerous thing that a medic could carry. This is why, as the Pacific War went on, medics and corpsmen removed their distinctive uniforms, looking and acting more like regular soldiers. These functions included their being armed and fighting side by side with the regular soldiers. As we've seen, these acts violated the Geneva Convention and therefore forfeited the protection afforded to medics. However, in practice, those protections had been made moot long before. As a result of the experience on the Eastern Front and Pacific theaters in World War II, modern medics and corpsmen are trained to carry weapons and are legally permitted to defend themselves and their patients if they are targeted. As recent conflicts tended to involve terror groups which have little regard to the Geneva Convention, it's unsurprising that the famous medic identifiers, the prominent symbols on armbands and helmets, have been used less frequently in modern wars. The final time they were seen in prominent use by the United States was during the Vietnam War, but unsurprisingly, the easy visibility of these symbols made medics ripe targets there too, so the classic red cross on a white background was dropped. Much as officers began to conceal themselves with less prominent uniforms in the 20th century in response to the improved accuracy of small arms and artillery that deliberately targeted them, medics were starting to conceal themselves as they too had begun to be deliberately targeted in modern wars. Modern medics in most armies are now difficult to identify on sight. The only sure way to tell is by how they act. This lack of visibility increasingly makes medics appear and sometimes act more like regular combat soldiers, not just on the front lines, but in support roles too. The British medic interviewed in Business Insider mentioned that in addition to carrying his medical equipment that can weigh between 50 and 80 pounds, he also needed to carry extra ammunition. Such ammunition included 51mm mortar rounds. As medics are starting to act more like regular soldiers, the same is also true in reverse. The return of state-based competition and the rise of anti-access area denial strategies mean that in a conflict with a peer or near-peer adversary, evacuating wounded soldiers to get treatment might not be as easy as it was during the War on Terror. Lieutenant General Sean B. McFarland, who observed medical evacuation practices in Afghanistan, warned in 2017 that in an A2AD environment, medevac might not be coming, at least not in time to save the lives of wounded soldiers. Therefore, he said, regular frontline soldiers would need to learn how to provide care at the point of injury and learn how to use the necessary medical equipment to save their wounded comrades' lives. In 2017, Tactical Combat Casualty Care (TC3) training kits were being sent out to selected brigade combat teams in order to train regular soldiers in the tasks that medics usually do. These kits have mannequins that mimic human breathing, bleeding pulses, and traumatic amputations. With these pieces of equipment in hand, a team of 3 medics can train 30 regular soldiers in common care methods, such as clearing obstructions to breathing, stopping traumatic bleeding, and chest decompressions. As part of a more comprehensive system of training, some soldiers have gone out with paramedics in major cities like New York to witness the treatment of injuries like gunshot wounds as a way to acclimate them to what it's like to deal with trauma on a routine basis. While these experiences cannot mimic all of the types of wounds seen on a battlefield, they can get soldiers used to responding quickly to trauma and instruct them on how to deliver aid in stressful conditions. Because field hospitals are also typically targeted, McFarland said they might need to be broken up into smaller, more modular units in the future. In a contest with a near-peer adversary that has access to precision weaponry, this doctrine becomes more important. Medical facilities would almost certainly be targeted in a modern state-based conflict, and we can see a preview of what international warfare in the 21st century might be like with the way the Russians have conducted themselves over the past 10 years. For example, Russia has frequently targeted hospitals in its campaigns in Syria and Ukraine, despite the Soviet Union's accession to the Geneva Convention in 1960 and its subsequent accession to the Convention's Protocol 2 in 1989. By February 2023, nearly 1 in 10 hospitals in Ukraine had been damaged by some kind of Russian attack. Medical workers in the country have also been targeted. In the first year of the war, nearly 200 medical workers were killed, injured, kidnapped, or arrested in a study done by a collaboration of human rights and healthcare-related NGOs. It's also notable that Russia withdrew from Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention in October 2019. This protocol authorizes the investigation of alleged war crimes against civilians. In justifying his decision to withdraw from Protocol 1, Putin claimed that the International Commission which conducts the investigations has effectively failed to carry out its functions since 1991. Russia's withdrawal from at least part of the Geneva Convention sets a precedent, and in the war in Ukraine, we have seen other actions which harken back to the treatment of medical facilities and personnel in the most brutal fighting of World War II. In September 2022, Ukrainian combat medics claimed they were also being targeted on an individual basis. In an interview with Vice, one Ukrainian combat medic who was identified only as Andriy mentioned that while on patrol, he and his squad came upon a bullet-riddled car with 3 dead soldiers inside. The 4th man was showing signs of life. Since these were all comrades, Andriy attempted to apply treatment to the wounded man, but his commander stopped him before he could do so. The prescient commander found a booby-trap grenade in the hand of the wounded man, leaving the squad no choice but to retreat and leave their injured comrade behind. Other booby-trap attacks include leaving grenades under dead bodies, an act designed to target medics and people collecting casualties. Both of these kind of booby traps are considered war crimes. As in World War II and Vietnam, Red Crosses on medical personnel and vehicles make them easy targets and have invited attacks in Ukraine. In the early days of the war, Andriy claimed that he and his colleagues, who had marked themselves with Red Crosses, were deliberately targeted. As a consequence, medics in Ukraine no longer wear the insignia, nor do they paint it on their vehicles. Now Ukrainian medics attire themselves similarly to their counterparts in other countries. While this has made them harder to identify, it has by no means left them safe. According to Andriy, the Russians study our behavior, they study the way we collaborate, and they study every action we perform. They know that after every massive artillery shootout, medics' cars arrive, and you can hit them with artillery. The arrival of drones on the battlefield has made medics more vulnerable. Russian drone operators have singled out medical evaluation vehicles and medics who treat casualties after artillery bombardments or engagements with small arms. As drones allow easy surveillance, Russian forces have used them to monitor troops carrying medical kits and backpacks who exit vehicles and mill among the fallen after a period of shelling or small arms combat. These medical personnel and their vehicles are then targeted either with loitering munitions or artillery strikes. These actions create a force multiplication effect for the Russians. A dead medic or wrecked ambulance means that many more Ukrainian soldiers will lose their lives in the absence of proper medical care and evacuation. These casualties and vehicles are also much harder to replace. By September 2022, Andriy was relying on volunteers to aid them with medical evacuation because so many evacuation vehicles and ambulances had been destroyed. Even in the face of a successful evacuation, the danger is far from over. The Russians have placed landmines on evacuation routes for ambulances and often targeted the vehicles with artillery strikes, hoping to create even more destruction among medical personnel and destruction among their vehicles. Ukrainian medics have also reported that Russian tanks fire on ambulances as well. Targeting medical personnel and equipment helps Russia win the war of attrition that has developed in Ukraine. Less access to medical care means more dead Ukrainian soldiers. Since Russia has a population of about 3 times as many people as Ukraine, Russia can take more losses, while each loss of a Ukrainian soldier is more difficult to replace. The math of attrition has led Russia to adopt a cynical calculation that it's better to ignore its Geneva Convention obligations for the sake of victory on the battlefield. The experiences in Ukraine have tended to confirm the remarks General McFarlane made on the vulnerability of traditional medical practices in modern war. Medevac will be more difficult in the face of peer or near-peer warfare defined by artillery, missiles and drones, and not the low-level explosive devices seen in the War on Terror. Such weapons create what Dr. Aaron Epstein calls mass casualty events. Epstein is one of the authors of the extensive report on the experiences of medics in Ukraine for the Journal of the American College of Surgeons. The study concluded that the United States must be prepared to treat the wounded far closer to the front line and protect them for longer periods of time in the face of much more difficult evacuation conditions, strengthening the idea that all modern soldiers must be prepared to apply medical aid of some kind. The Geneva Conventions are the only series of treaties that have the distinction of being entered into by all countries. However, in practice, their provisions have been ignored by many of the countries that are parties to them. Russia's withdrawal from Protocol 1 set a precedent that, if necessary, certain countries will abandon the Geneva Conventions for the sake of their interests, whether formally or not. The conduct of the wars in Syria and Ukraine show that in a 21st century international conflict, which would involve states like Russia, China, and their partners like North Korea and Iran, traditional protections for medical personnel afforded by the First Geneva Convention might become increasingly irrelevant. The Geneva Conventions were expressions of the growing power of liberal political ideology around the world, but the resurgence of authoritarianism is increasingly challenging this ideology and revealing the anarchical nature of international relations. As there is no true lawmaking body in the international arena, all treaties require the accession of self-interested states. For a time, the First Geneva Convention and protection of medics seemed like it would be in the interest of the signatory parties. But that is increasingly no longer so. Long before this point, medics were being blurred into the ranks of normal soldiers, and the trends of rising, anti-humanitarian, authoritarian powers and new technology on the battlefield might mean that protections afforded to medics become as moot in the future as they were before the First Geneva Convention. What do you think the future of the combat medic will be? Will all soldiers be forced to become medics of some kind? Will the trend of ignoring the Geneva and Hague Conventions on the battlefield continue? Make sure to let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. World wars lead to the loss of millions of lives, the dissolution of empires, the vanishing of states from the global landscape, the emergence of new nations, the birth of numerous innovations, and the creation of a transformed global reality. Simply put, they change everything, as clearly demonstrated by World War I and especially World War II. But what would happen if World War III started today? How would it start? Let's be real, the probability of such a war is always there. It can be both accidental and purposeful. Accidents may encompass technical failures in nuclear weapons facilities, human errors, the commandeering of control systems by terrorist organizations within the nuclear-armed states, and the unintended launch of nuclear-armed missiles due to external elements such as UFO sightings, natural disasters, or extraterrestrial anomalies like solar flares. It can even be false alarms or computer viruses, such a false trigger to start a war. But the most obvious reason would probably be the escalation of long-term conflicts. Among the serious conflicts capable of provoking the start of a world war could be the aggravation of the dispute between China and the United States regarding the status of Taiwan and world supremacy. Another very possible scenario is the escalation of the war in Ukraine by the Kremlin. Despite the fact that the probability of a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia is still low, the risk of an escalation of the conflict exists. Even a local conflict between Turkey and Greece can have a huge impact. At first glance, it may seem that this is not serious enough for the beginning of the Third World War. However, if the conflict between these NATO member states escalates into military confrontation, it could have negative consequences for the entire world. The conflict on the Korean Peninsula, the territorial disputes between Pakistan and India, the war in Syria, the Gaza Strip, and other points of conflict are worth mentioning. No one thought that the murder in Sarajevo would lead to the deaths of millions, but it happened. Some countries openly go into conflict or are ready for it. On occasion, they mention their nuclear arsenal or military power. Several of these nations find themselves marginalized by the global community, including North Korea, Iran, and recently Russia. Rogue countries and authoritarian states are the most dangerous, in particular because of the less predictable nature of leaders' actions and fewer institutional constraints. In general, a purposeful conflict can occur due to the redistribution of political and economic spheres of influence or a lack of resources. The attack on any country of the nuclear club, the use of weapons by any member of the nuclear club against a non-member country due to a threat to national security, and a retaliatory strike by another member of the nuclear club in defense of the weaker one can also provoke a war. What situations almost led to the beginning of the Third World War in the past? Even before the end of the Second World War, there was talk of a Third World War. History counts many examples when small military conflicts could become the beginning of the Third World War. In the period between 1945 and the revolutions in 1989 that led to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the apocalyptic scenario of a Third World War was viewed primarily as a possible confrontation between the superpowers, the USA, and the Soviet Union. Several times during this period, the superpowers found themselves on the brink of direct military conflict. At the beginning of the Berlin blockade on June 24, 1948, the military governor of the American zone of occupation, General Lucius D. Clay, proposed breaking the blockade with an armed convoy. However, American President Harry S. Truman rejected this because of the associated risk of war. In the Korean War, 1950–53, there was a constant danger of escalation. For example, General Douglas MacArthur was accused of wanting to use nuclear weapons against China. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, Soviet Minister Mykola Bulganin sent a note to British Prime Minister Anthony Eden with a warning: if this war does not stop, it would be in danger of turning into the Third World War. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is considered the point at which the risk of World War III was greatest, and Robert McNamara has stated that if not for Vasil Arkhipov, who prevented a nuclear launch on a Soviet submarine at the height of the crisis, then World War III would have started. The same thing happened later. On September 26, 1983, Soviet early warning stations under the command of Stanislav Petrov mistakenly detected 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Petrov correctly assessed the situation as a false alarm and did not report his discovery to his superiors. Petrov's actions most likely helped to avoid a nuclear conflict, since Soviet policy at the time would have caused a nuclear response after the detection of the ballistic missiles. Similar errors in notification systems also happened in the USA. Even military exercises can cause escalation. For example, NATO's Able Archer 83 exercise starting on November 2, 1983, was considered a possible provocation by the USSR. In response, it prepared to bring the nuclear forces and the air force in East Germany and Poland into a state of combat readiness. Other historical moments of tension were Sino-Soviet border conflicts in 1969, the Yom Kippur War superpower tensions, 6th to 25th October 1973, the Norwegian rocket incident on January 25, 1995, between Norway, the USA, and Russia, the incident at Pristina Airport on June 12, 1999, between NATO and Russia, and the shooting down of a Russian Sukhoi bomber by Turkey on November 24, 2015. As we can see, there was a lot of tension between the world's strongest states. These states have significant influence and many allies, so that can lead to a global conflict. Suppose that the USA, NATO countries, Israel, Taiwan, Ukraine, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and some other states would be involved in this war against China, Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, parts of the Arab countries, and some other states. Suppose that the position of many countries would fluctuate, but sooner or later they would be drawn into the war. So what would happen if the Third World War begins today? A possible answer is the nuclear threat and the destruction of the world. Considering the rapid advancements in potential scenarios for a Third World War featuring nuclear weapons, it's worth noting that the initial retaliatory strike, capable of annihilating the enemy's major cities and military installations, could transpire in a matter of minutes. As per calculations in the scientific journal of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, deploying 5,000 nuclear warheads with a combined yield of 2 gigatons on major cities in the Northern Hemisphere could result in the simultaneous demise of 750 million people due to a single destructive element, the shockwave. However, despite the existing military potential of the states that are members of the nuclear club, the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons by these states remains low due to the current lack of an effective defense strategy that would be able to protect the aggressor from retribution from the victim. Attempts to create an effective missile defense system have had some success, for example within the framework of the SDI program, but the effectiveness of such a system is far from 100%, and the risk of falling under a nuclear attack on one's own territory, even on a much smaller scale than on the enemy's territory, is politically unacceptable for all developed countries. But would such a risk be unacceptable for example, North Korea? Currently, the sole method of safeguarding against nuclear weapons is to place economically vital installations in deep underground bunkers. This is an exceptionally challenging endeavor from an economic perspective, and as a result, only highly critical defense entities such as NORAD, situated in Cheyenne Mountain, employ underground shelters. North American Aerospace Defense Command, a joint initiative of the United States and Canada, offers aerospace surveillance, air sovereignty, and protection for both countries. Nevertheless, in practice, the devastation of defense facilities, including military-industrial complexes, and critical infrastructure like ports, bridges, transport hubs, and power plants, along with a significant civilian population residing near the target areas, while highly severe, is not an insurmountable catastrophe on the national and global scales. The presence of an effective civil defense system can substantially reduce civilian casualties. For instance, Switzerland has a well-established network of nuclear shelters, which, following the Fukushima nuclear incident, gained renewed importance as protection against potential man-made disasters of this kind. It's entirely plausible that a conflict involving thermonuclear weapons may extend beyond mere reciprocal bombings following the initial and retaliatory strikes. Instead, it could evolve into conventional warfare, with parties vying for control over specific theaters of military operations. The selective use of nuclear weapons might readily lead to further escalation and more extensive mutual destruction. Many countries have implemented civil defense systems, including underground subway networks, in preparation for war. However, the efficacy of underground shelters in preserving lives and aiding survival in a nuclear attack, while radiation remains elevated, remains a subject of debate. The beginning of a global nuclear war would look like this. Between the warning of the country's population about the beginning of a nuclear war and the explosion itself, there are no more than 10 to 14 minutes. The government receives earlier warnings if there are modern missile defense systems, but it takes time to trigger a general warning. Not so many people would be able to find underground shelter during this time. After this, millions of people who did not have time to find shelter would instantly become victims. But those who were able to survive the explosion would soon face a painful fate. Even far from the epicenter of the explosion, the territory would most likely be uninhabitable for many decades due to radiation. However, all the consequences of a nuclear war can only be discussed in theory. Even if a global atomic war does not lead to the death of all living things and humanity survives, it would survive as our ancestors did several hundred years ago. The technological and information wars are the keys to the 21st century. The Russian-Ukrainian war experience offers valuable insights into anticipating the dynamics of a potential Third World War. Notably, technology now plays an increasingly significant role in granting soldiers better territorial control. Regions previously patrolled by brigades of thousands are now overseen by battalions of several hundred. In Ukraine, around 350,000 Russian troops will be deployed along a 746-mile front in 2023, averaging about 469 soldiers per mile, considerably fewer than during World War II. On the surface, this might seem advantageous for attackers, as thinner front lines are easier to breach. Advanced sensors, precise ammunition, and improved digital networks enhance target identification and elimination. However, offensive forces must still concentrate to break through fortified front lines, which can be detected and targeted, albeit not always, but more frequently than before. Consequently, ground warfare experiences a notable shift in favor of the defender. This creates a paradox. High-precision warfare can offset some advantages of massive armies, but it doesn't entirely replace the need for numerical strength. Artificial intelligence would be everywhere in this war. The capabilities of advanced algorithmic combat systems are so formidable that their advantage can be likened to the superiority of tactical nuclear weapons over conventional ones. The kill chain, which outlines the steps for target destruction, enables the immediate retrieval and analysis of data from satellites, yielding the most precise real-time situational awareness. Equipped with this up-to-the-minute information, commanders can effectively navigate through the ambiguities inherent in warfare, often referred to as the fog of war. Utilizing AI, analysts discern the enemy's location and determine the most suitable weaponry for the current scenario. An essential function of these digital systems is to forecast and devise optimal combat strategies based on the prevailing circumstances. The tactics of the world's most advanced nations hinge on the swift deployment of rapid response units, drones, missiles, and aircraft. Yet these tactics prove pivotal, primarily in situations where the adversary lags in technology or the conflict remains geographically limited. The development and application of cutting-edge technologies would be a crucial factor in achieving success. The internet would emerge as a new global battleground, with initial attacks directed at the computer systems governing civilian and military operations. Gaining a strategic advantage involves disrupting the enemy's communication channels, sowing chaos, hindering their ability to respond to attacks, and mobilizing the population and military. Immediate assaults would also target computers that support critical city functions and infrastructure, including telecommunications, water supply, electricity, fire services, transportation, and more. Despite these measures, global conflict and widespread destruction would quickly become known to humanity. Online hostilities and propaganda campaigns would commence, accompanied by hacking operations targeting websites and servers to gather classified information or disseminate deceptive data that benefits another nation. In a prolonged conflict, a struggle for the support and allegiance of the general population would take place. The internet would serve as a more effective medium for propaganda compared to what existed in previous eras. This battle would extend to shaping the opinions of nations not yet engaged in the war. In a worldwide conflict, every potential resource becomes valuable. Information and various forms of pressure would foster instability in neutral countries, making global warfare a prevailing topic across the globe. Some nations, however, have robust safeguards such as stringent internet censorship. Yes, nothing happened in Tiananmen Square. Economic collapse, large-scale ruin, victims, and refugees, the long-term crisis would be a global legacy. A world war's aftermath would bring suffering to all, with each passing day adding to the toll of victims. The war would result in a staggering loss of life and mass displacement, creating an unprecedented number of refugees and internally displaced individuals. Many would seize the chance to escape the conflict to neutral nations, seeking refuge from the battlegrounds. A global conflict would trigger substantial transformations in the world economy and supply chains. The initial days would be marred by panic in many countries, rapid price hikes, increased crime rates, traffic congestion, acts of terrorism, protests, and more. Rapid economic deterioration would ensue as former key trading allies transform into opponents, with each side striving to cripple the resources of the other. The potential shifts in world GDP, oil production, human development indices, etc. are hard to fathom. The impact of the war would reverberate across all aspects of people's lives. For many countries, the consequences may surpass those of previous global financial crises, jeopardizing their stability and preparedness for conflict. The resulting humanitarian crisis would be unprecedented, paralleled by the destruction of humanity's cultural heritage, infrastructure, and all other assets. A protracted conflict would lay the groundwork for a possible worldwide famine, particularly in the most vulnerable nations. Even neutral states would suffer significantly as the warring factions prioritize their own interests over all else. It's difficult to even imagine the ecological consequences of such a disaster. Any military conflict causes enormous damage to the environment. Ecosystems cannot be divided by conventional boundaries by drawing them on a map. If the natural balance is destroyed in one geolocation, it will definitely be felt in another. The global war will result in numerous explosions in fuel and lubricant depots and petroleum product storage facilities, leading to environmental repercussions. These will encompass air raids on facilities utilizing hazardous chemicals in their manufacturing processes, along with the disruption and destruction of treatment plants, resulting in sewage contamination of water bodies. Furthermore, it will cause harm to the soil cover and extensive forest fires, particularly in protected natural areas. Thousands of plant species may face extinction as a result of the conflict. The warfare disrupts the tranquility of wildlife, causing them to either perish or seek refuge to escape the conflict zones. Military operations will unfold in regions of international significance, eradicating habitats for rare and unique species, thereby potentially altering bird behavior, including migration patterns. Forests, essential for global food security and playing a protective role, will be decimated by combat operations, impacting the climate and potentially triggering substantial erosion, including wind erosion and desertification. All of these consequences will inevitably have repercussions for agriculture. During rocket and projectile detonations, a range of chemical compounds forms, including carbon monoxide, brown gas, nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde, and more. The explosion results in the complete oxidation of these substances, releasing the products of this chemical reaction into the atmosphere. Importantly, polluted air transcends borders. Emissions generated by the war traverse, settle, and impact the territories of other nations, often at distances spanning thousands of miles. Landmine detonations contaminate the soil with heavy metals like lead, strontium, titanium, cadmium, and nickel. This contamination renders the soil hazardous and, in some cases, unfit for future agricultural purposes. Explosions also give rise to forest fires. The potential outcomes of a nuclear war have the theoretical capacity to trigger catastrophic shifts in the planet's climate and environmental conditions, commonly referred to as a nuclear winter or nuclear autumn. This perspective has significantly influenced the role of nuclear weapons as a tool of strategic deterrence, discouraging adversaries from initiating a nuclear conflict. In the worst case, a substantial volume of nuclear fallout would disperse globally, resulting in a prolonged increase in background radiation on Earth that can cause the death of billions. A new world war, new opportunities. As the saying goes, maintaining optimism even in the direst situations is crucial. Let's attempt to identify positive aspects in the event of World War III erupting today. Firstly, it's important to recognize that ultimately, the conflict will come to an end, paving the way for peace. The aftermath of the war will undoubtedly trigger a profound and unpredictable transformation in the landscape of international relations. Countries will need to swiftly adapt to these shifts in the midst of ongoing turmoil and violence. Comprehending these potential consequences reaffirms the critical need for global leaders to prioritize diplomacy over warfare as we navigate our interconnected future. As geopolitical structures evolve, influential international organizations such as the United Nations and the World Health Organization may see their roles and authority challenged due to decreased cooperation among powerful nations. This could open the door for the emergence of new institutions and organizations dedicated to addressing urgent global challenges that arise during times of conflict. Amidst the wreckage of the old world, opportunities for growth and advancement may emerge if humanity can safeguard its previous accomplishments. Wars often stimulate rapid technological advancements as countries allocate substantial resources to research and development for military purposes. Once the dust settles, these technologies may transition to civilian applications, accelerating overall societal progress. For example, innovations in areas like post-conflict reconstruction, environmental restoration, and medical advancements may bring about positive changes. The devastating consequences of World War III can underscore humanity's shared aspiration for peace and a collective commitment for preventing the recurrence of such catastrophic events. The collective trauma experienced during this conflict will have profound and far-reaching effects. It can prompt introspection regarding past mistakes and drive us to seek more diplomatic solutions as we move forward. Due to the extensive impact of World War III on countries worldwide, governments may be inclined to strengthen diplomatic bonds with one another in an effort to avoid future conflicts. This renewed emphasis on diplomacy has the potential to usher in a new era of international cooperation and peaceful dispute resolution. Such a movement towards an ideal world is possible even without war, but a lot still needs to be done for it. What if World War III never happened? In this scenario, the world would persist along its current trajectory. Periodically, local conflicts, revolutions, and wars may emerge. Economic rivalries, military exercises, and the quest for influence would remain integral to the major powers. However, the overarching result would be global peace and stability for the majority of the world's populace. Nations would increasingly shift their focus towards economic and social advancement rather than engaging in military confrontations. This outlook would become more prevalent across the globe. The frequency of conflicts and casualties would gradually diminish. The absence of war paves the way for economic expansion. Countries would no longer need to allocate extensive resources to massive military expenditures, enabling greater investments in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Scientific research and innovation can thrive in an environment of healthy competition and the innate human aspiration for improved living standards. Over time, international cooperation would strengthen through heightened accountability, fortified diplomatic relations, and active participation in global initiatives addressing issues such as climate change, global health, and poverty reduction. The absence of large-scale conflicts would safeguard millions of lives and the existing environment. Art and culture would also prosper during peacetime, as would social well-being. Populations across the globe could enjoy enhanced social conditions, improved living standards, and increased access to education and healthcare. The future. If World War III were to occur in today's world, it would emerge as a global conflict involving numerous nations and would have profound implications for the state of international relations. The worldwide scope of such a conflict has the potential to reshape the established global order. Many powerful countries would probably lose their role. The dynamics of a global conflict in the 21st century would be fundamentally influenced by technological advancements, yet it would likely be a protracted engagement. In this context, the internet would play a pivotal role. Initially, cyber attacks on systems governing civilian and military infrastructure would be a primary target. The primary objectives would encompass disrupting communications networks and sowing chaos. Subsequent phases of the conflict would involve online propaganda, hacking, and disinformation campaigns, further intensifying the confrontation. Given the global reach of the internet, even neutral countries would be drawn into this information warfare. The immediate aftermath of such a world war would entail economic collapse, widespread devastation, and severe environmental damage. However, amid this destruction, there may emerge opportunities for recovery and advancement if humanity can preserve its prior achievements. Diplomacy, cooperation, and the pursuit of peace would become even more crucial in the post-war era. There is no need for another world war to understand such basic things. Humanity should strengthen the influence of international organizations that help states and people resolve conflicts. Politicians must understand that cooperation with others is important for global stability. Many recipes for presenting wars are offered, from economic integration and globalization of the world to building up one's own army. The only common thing is the understanding that if the Third World War started today, tomorrow might not come. Millions of people would be mobilized to the battlefield, and cruelty and anger would become commonplace for the millions or billions of broken hearts of those who survived. Analysis of the prospects of this war is important for the realization of all mankind. There will be no winners in this war. Do you think there would be? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.